it's time to sit back and relax with your favorite drink. And listen. The Stairway. The hike was long, nearly 6 miles. The first 5 were easy enough, but the last mile was a series of constant switchbacks on a steep slope that left me gasping for air with each step. We were exhausted and drenched in sweat, but in good spirits when we finally arrived at the top of the ridge shortly before sunset. My friends seemed eager to explore the nearby landscape, and I shared their enthusiasm. From what we'd heard, the view here was stunning. It was our annual summer camping trip, a rigid tradition that had endured since childhood. My family and the families of my 3 best friends, who also happened to be my neighbors, spent a week in this park every summer. It was a serene environment that allowed one to shed their stress, their worries, and all the troubles of the previous year. Here, next to the sprawling forests of pines and under the shadow of the Appalachian Mountains, we came to forget the problems of life and simply enjoyed ourselves. I had many fond memories of this place that spanned throughout my childhood. Fishing and swimming in lakes, marshmallows and ghost stories over the campfire, hiking along the many trails that covered the park. I look forward to this trip each and every year. However, this year was slightly different. Our families had stayed at the usual campgrounds while Tony, Astor, Margaret and I hiked onward to a different area. For many years we'd been told that there was a campground on top of a ridge that offered an absolutely incredible view of the valley below. On more than a few occasions my friends and I had begged our parents to take us there, but we could never convince them to make the long hike. For our younger siblings, 6 miles was simply too far to walk. At least, that was the excuse they used. Nevertheless, we collectively convinced our parents to allow us to make the hike all alone this year. They'd agreed that we were definitely old enough to camp out on our own, and wished us well on our journey. And here we were, 5 hours later, on top of the heavily forested ridge and excited to pitch our tents. As soon as we reached the top of the ridge, the dirt path leveled off. There were pine trees on either side of the path that cast long shadows in the evening sun. About 100 yards ahead, the other edge of the ridge could be seen, and we picked up our pace in anticipation of the view. I noticed that there was a small building at the edge of the path that was built very close to the cliff. It looked like a house, and I curiously wondered who'd be living up here. Turning my mind back towards the reason we were here, I hurried past the house with my friends and arrived at the opposite end of the ridge. The view was everything we'd anticipated. The setting sun illuminated the valley below us. The August grass shone gold and waved with a light breeze that swept through the valley. A few wisps of clouds gently floated through the sky and were illuminated red by the dying beams of sunlight. I heard Astor and Margaret gasp in awe as they admired the landscape. Tony and I stood in silent appreciation, taking in the beauty. We must have stood there for close to 10 minutes as the sun sank ever lower towards the horizon. We were so hypnotized that we failed to notice the man behind us. Well, as soon as I turned around, I saw him. An old man. He looked perhaps 70, and he sat in a chair, smoking a cigarette on the porch of the building I'd seen earlier. He was looking at us with an amused expression on his face as he puffed away. Feeling a little embarrassed that all 4 of us had walked past him without so much as saying good evening, I decided to approach him and introduce myself. His eyes locked on me as I walked up to his front porch. "Good evening," I said in a friendly tone. "Damn right it is," the old man immediately responded, taking another drag on his cigarette. Well, I was a little startled by his forwardness, but I smiled and introduced myself. "My name's Chris Harding," I said as I extended a hand to him. The old man pulled a tobacco-stained hand out of his right pocket and gave me a good, firm handshake. Walter Mxngled," he said with a smile. "And these are my friends, Astor, Tony, and Margaret," I said, pointing to each of them. "Sorry for not noticing you earlier." Walter waved his hand in a dismissive manner. "That's all right. That view is a lot prettier than me." He chuckled. My friends and I chuckled along with him. I liked his sense of humor. "Oh, we've never been up here before. We didn't know anybody had a house up here. What makes you live here?" I asked. Walter held out his hand, palm upwards, pointing towards the scenery behind us. His eyebrows were raised in amusement. I immediately felt incredibly stupid for asking such a question. "Oh yeah, that's some view, isn't it?" I said. "It is, ain't it? Best time of the whole damn year, actually. You want to be here in January. Winters are something fierce," he stated. "Do you live here alone?" Just me. Been here my whole life, and I don't ever plan on moving." "So, you grew up around here?" "Sure did. Used to be a little town down in that valley. That's where I was born and raised." "What happened to it?" I inquired. "The town, why isn't it there anymore?" "Well, nothing happened to it so much as it just withered away. All the young folk of my time moved on. Didn't want to live their lives in a tiny little town in the middle of nowhere," Walter said, with a touch of sadness in his voice. "But not you. You didn't want to go anywhere?" "No, not me. Perfectly happy to be here till I'm dead." Walter said nothing further and seemed to go into deep thought. We stood around awkwardly for close to a minute before finally deciding to say goodbye and head to the camping area. We were tired from our hike and needed to pitch our tents and sleep. "Excuse me," I said, waking Walter from his silent contemplations. "How do we get to the campgrounds from here?" The campgrounds, yeah. Just follow the trail there for about half a mile. Goes all along the ridge and it'll lead you straight to a clearing where you can set up camp. You'll have the place all to yourselves. Hardly anybody comes up here anymore." Walter pointed to the right of his house, and our eyes followed his finger. There was a thin dirt path leading into the trees. "Okay, thanks for your help, Mr. Mxngled," I said. We waved goodbye to him and started to turn towards the trail. Just as my head turned away from the house, something caught my eye. It was another trail, even thinner, that led into the trees on the left side of the house. "Where does that trail lead?" I asked, nodding my head towards the other path. Walter glanced over towards it, and a smile crept onto his lips. He took a drag on his cigarette and responded. "Oh, that trail. It leads to the stairway," he said casually. "The what?" "The stairway. That's what everyone calls it. Don't think it has a proper name." "What's the stairway?" I inquired, genuinely curious. "It's the damn strangest thing I ever saw. Just a set of stairs carved out of rock. Goes right over the cliff. Been there just about forever." "What?" I said incredulously. A stairway made out of rock right over the cliff?" "Yeah, exactly that. You've got to see it to believe it, but it's there." "Who built it? Why would anyone build something like that?" "Well, about 10 years ago, these archaeologists came up here to look at it. They got a load of fancy tools and such. One of them tells me it's nearly 900 years old, if you can believe it. So I guess the Indians must have built it. There sure as hell wasn't anybody else here 900 years ago." "I see. Why did the Native Americans build it?" I asked. "Ain't nobody got a clue. Well, those archaeologists couldn't even tell how they built it. Said it looked like the staircase was carved straight out of the rock. But the way it sticks out over the side of the ridge, there couldn't have been any mountain to carve it out of. In fact, it's a damn miracle it hasn't fallen over. Shouldn't even be standing with how it is," Walter explained. "At least, that's what the archaeologists say." The way he emphasized the word archaeologists made it clear that Walter was not telling the full story and was merely waiting for us to ask him to elaborate. I decided to humor him. After all, he clearly didn't get many visitors. "So, what do other people say?" Walter's face lit up in honest excitement as he was given the opportunity to tell a story. His cigarette was nearly gone, and he threw the butt on the ground and pulled a new one from his pocket. As he lit it with a match, He looked at us and asked, "You kids like ghost stories?" "Sure, we love ghost stories," Astor exclaimed. The rest of us nodded in agreement. Many ghost stories had been swapped between our families over a campfire, and a fresh one was always welcome. "Well, pull up your pants and get ready, 'cause I've got one hell of a story for you," Walter said as he puffed on his new cigarettes. "So, there's this god, you see. It rules over this land and—" "Is this a Native American legend?" Margaret cut him off. "Well, to tell you the truth, miss, I don't know. Very well could be, but I don't got a clue where it came from. It's just a story I heard as a boy. Jimmy Dwight's granddad used to tell it when he was drunk as hell and couldn't keep his old mouth shut." Walter laughed hard, and his laughter turned into a wheeze, which turned into a coughing fit that lasted several minutes. When he'd finally composed himself, he continued with the story. "So, anyways, there's a god that rules over this land. He's got these spirits under his command. These spirits, they got a job. When someone's close to death, when their time has come, so to speak, these spirits go to the dying man and they help him along. They take him and show him the way to the next life. So, they're good spirits, you see. They help people to go peacefully." Walter ruminated for a moment. It looked as if he was having trouble remembering the story. "So, anyways, what was I saying? Oh, yeah, there's the good spirits that take dying people away. Except one of these spirits was actually no good. He didn't do his job right. He liked when people died, you see. There's something about it. Something about death that he liked. So he starts taking people when it ain't their time. Healthy people, young people. People that got no business dying. And this bad spirit, he's killing them. Just for the sake of killing. Ain't that awful?" "Yeah, sounds real bad," Tony agreed. "This mean spirit, he goes around killing people for no good reason. And the killing seems to give him power, makes him stronger. So the god figures that this can't go on any longer. So he banishes him. The bad spirit gets thrown out of God's realm, heaven you could call it. He lands on his ass, right in this area. Most of his power's gone too, but not all." "So, the evil spirit's here, roaming around. Is that it?" Astor asked. "Oh, you're ahead of me, young lady," Walter responded. "As I said, most of the bad spirit's power is gone, but not all. He's still got some juice left. Like I said, killing makes him stronger, so he keeps on killing. Except he doesn't bother with individuals no more. Oh, that ain't no fun. He likes groups of people. Groups he can play with. He taunts them, like a cat taunts a mouse before killing it. And the more the people suffer before they die, the more power he gets. What does he use his power for, you ask? Well, he uses it to build that damn stairway. Every time he does some poor group of people in, he heads on over to that stairway and uses the power to add an extra step to it. In fact, it's his power that keeps the stairway from falling over. He's been building that stairway for close to 1,000 years. He's a patient little bastard. He's building it upwards so that one day he can get back to heaven and have his revenge." Walter laughed hard again, but thankfully his laughter did not degenerate into another coughing fit. "Well, how's that for a stairway to heaven?" I chuckled at the reference to the song, but I was also impressed by Walter's story. It certainly was a rather creepy tale. It seemed perfectly tailored to scare them, an evil spirit roaming these lands, only preying on groups of people such as themselves. An excellent ghost story. "And how many steps are on this stairway now? How many groups of people come here and meet with a terrible fate?" I asked with an amused tone. There's... Walter trailed off. "Well, I'll be damned if I haven't forgot. I went on that stairway when I was young and counted the steps, but that was long ago. I can't remember how many steps there were. Well, of course, you're free to go and find out." Walter's coy offer piqued my interest, and I also found that it interested my friends. He told us that the trail leading to the stairway was only a few 100 yards long, and we'd still have time to see it before the sunset. It didn't take much convincing to get us on the path to see the legendary set of stairs. My mouth hung open in shock. It was exactly as Walter had described it. Even so, I was still completely blown away by what I saw. A large staircase, made entirely of grey rock, jutting out over the edge of the ridge. It was steep and had no support as far as I could tell. It looked as if it should fall over at any second. I could tell that my friends were as amazed as I was. I'd never seen anything like it in my life. Walter had understated when he called it the damn strangest thing he ever saw. We silently stared at the stone monstrosity for a long time. The sun was starting to touch the horizon when Tony spoke. "How many?" "How many what?" I responded. "How many steps are there? Count them. I'm sure as hell not walking out on that thing." All four of us began counting the stone steps in our heads as the remaining rays of sunlight illuminated the stairway. I lost count once and had to start over. 39, Margaret declared. Tony and Asta agreed with her count. I was the last one to finish my tally of the stairs, and I arrived at the same conclusion. 39, I agreed. 39 groups of people, killed by the evil spirit that haunts these lands, Tony said in an overdone, spooky voice. We laughed, and Astor mentioned that we should tell all our parents about this place as soon as the week was over. We had a great ghost story to share. The sun finally dipped below the horizon and left behind only a blood-red sky. We decided to head back towards Walter's house and take the path to the campground, promising ourselves that we'd come back to see the stairway at least once before the week was over. Well, the walk to the campground was fairly uneventful. We saw Walter again as we passed by his house and told him that there were 39 steps on the stairway. He mumbled something along the lines of, "Sounds about right," before bidding us good night and heading into his house. It took less than 15 minutes to walk the half-mile path to the camping area. In the fading twilight, we chatted and did our best to spook each other with dreadful stories of the evil spirit that lurked in these woods. About halfway through the walk, Tony spotted the dirty skeleton of a squirrel laying just off the path. Asta, the most squeamish member of our group, had been unwilling to so much as look at it, so Tony had picked up the skull and chased her with it, laughing as she let out angry cries of disgust. While Margaret scolded him like a mother, warning him that he could get all sorts of diseases from animal carcasses, but Tony didn't seem to care. He chased Astor with the skull for most of the walk before finally tossing it on the ground and kicking it into the trees. It was these types of antics that I missed, and so dearly looked forward to each year as I camped with my friends. The campground was merely a clearing in the woods. It was uneven ground, a long and narrow scar in the woods that followed the high ridge we were upon. There were 3 fire pits lined up in a nice row, along with room for 3 groups to set up camp. We had the entire place to ourselves. We were seasoned experts at pitching tents, and Tony and I had a race against Astor and Margaret to see who could pitch their tents faster. Tony and I won by just a few seconds, and the girls cried foul because the ground beneath their tent was rockier and harder to drive a stake into. We all had a good laugh over it. The tent that Tony and I were using was closest to the trail, and Margaret and Astor's tent was directly opposite to ours, with a fire pit between us. In the cool night air, we built a bright campfire and cooked hot dogs on sticks, each taking turns coming up with new ghost stories. From the position of the moon, I could tell that it was easily past midnight when we finally decided to crawl into our tents and drift into sleep, exhausted from the long hike. The next day was wonderful. There were no clouds in the sky, and a gentle breeze swept through the trees, keeping us cool with the hot August sun above. We passed time in bliss, exploring the nearby woods. Margaret stumbled upon a small, pretty stream not far from the camp, and we must have spent 2 hours sitting with our feet in the refreshing cold water. Nobody said anything. Nobody needed to say anything. We were as content as we'd ever been. The day, so far, had been perfect. Unfortunately, that perfection would not last. It was evening and Tony was building the campfire. Margaret had gone into the woods to go to the bathroom, and Astor sat directly behind Tony, watching him toss wood into the fire. I had just entered our tent to retrieve the hot dogs for our evening meal when I heard Tony scream. It was a clear scream of pain that echoed throughout the woods and jolted me upright. Rushing outside, I saw Tony laying on the ground next to the roaring fire. His cries of agony had ceased, and he now clutched his left hand to his chest, biting his lower lip and taking deep breaths. I could see that the side of his left hand, from his pinky finger to his wrist, was an angry shade of red and covered with blisters. I immediately knew that Tony had burned himself. Now, as an experienced camper, I was accustomed to emergencies, and I quickly ran back into our tent. We'd brought a first aid kit that included burn ointment. I was rummaging through my backpack, searching for the burn cream, when Tony began cussing. "Astor, what the fuck did you do that for?" Tony cursed. There was clear anger in his voice. "What?" I heard Astor stutter. "Why the fuck did you push me?" I found the burn cream and some bandages and stepped outside the tent to see what the problem was. Tony's face had become red with rage, and Astor stood with a shocked expression on her face. Tony looked at me while pointing at Astor. "Christ, that bitch tried to push me into the fire." I was extremely confused by the accusation that Tony was making. I turned my head to look at Astor, who was pale with shock, then looked back at Tony. "Tony, what are you saying?" I asked as I walked over to him and bent down to apply ointment to his hand. I could see that there was no charring of the skin, which meant that the burns were only second degree. That was good. The hand would heal fully. "She pushed me. She freaking pushed me towards the fire and I got burned," he hissed with venom in his voice. Tony winced as I wrapped a bandage around his hand. I was disturbed by what he was saying. Tony had always been the most level-headed member of our group. I didn't understand why he was accusing Astor of hurting him. "You just fell down. You tripped and you stuck your hand in the fire. That's all that happened," I said calmly. "Don't blame Astor." "I was pushed. I felt it. Someone pushed me really hard, right in the back. I didn't frickin' trip. I know someone pushed me. Well, Margaret isn't here, and you were in the tent. But Astor was right behind me the whole time. She definitely pushed me." I looked back at Astor and could tell that she was close to crying. I'd known her since I was a toddler, and she was one of the sweetest people I'd ever met. There was no way, absolutely no way, that she'd try to push Tony into the fire. "Tony, why would she do that? Why would Astor push you into a fire? Think about what you're saying," I rationalized. I don't know. Maybe she's mad. Mad about the squirrel skull I chased her with. Yeah, she was mad about that and wanted revenge. Astor choked back a sob. "Tony, I would never do that. Push you into a fire, that's horrible. I'm sorry about your hand, but..." "Yeah, sorry that my head didn't go into the fire instead," Tony sneered back. "I'm lucky I caught my balance and only touched some embers. Jeez, I nearly lost my freaking face." Astor then burst into tears and ran into her tent. I could hear her sobbing into her sleeping bag. Now I was angry, and I turned to Tony. "What the hell's wrong with you? Why did you make Astor cry?" I asked Tony in an angry tone. "Because..." Shut up. Shut up and think about it. You've known Astor as long as I have. Have you ever seen her do something mean? Even once? Tony's face softened. His eyes fell to the ground. "Well, no, I haven't, but nothing. You're being ridiculous. Astor didn't push you into the fire. Nobody pushed you, you just fell. Go apologize to Astor for making her cry. Immediately." I'd always been the strong voice of command in our group. Tony capitulated and went into the tent to apologize to Astor, but not before insisting that someone had indeed pushed him into the fire. Margaret returned from the woods, and we filled her in on what had happened to Tony. She suggested that we should cut our trip short and get him to a doctor, but Tony was completely against the idea. He insisted that the burn was not serious. The ointment and bandages kept his hand from hurting badly, and there was no point in ruining the trip, he said. And so, with Tony and Astor on good terms again, we fell asleep in our tents and spent another cool, pleasant night on the ridge. I awoke, just screaming. Not a scream of pain, but a scream of fear. It was high and shrill, jolting me upright from a deep sleep. Even before I stepped out of my tent, I knew it was Astor. Only she could produce such a sharp cry from her vocal cords. The sun had just begun to rise, sending fresh beams of sunlight through the trees. I wearily stumbled out of the tent, rubbing the sleep from my eyes. Our tents and the grass were covered with sparkling dew, but I had no time to admire the beauty of early morning. Becoming more alert, I noticed that Astor was standing in the entrance to her tent with her hands over her mouth. Margaret had been awakened by the sudden scream and stood behind her. Both of them looked down towards the ground in front of their tent. I followed their gaze and saw that something laid in the dirt. I walked around the fire pit towards the girl's tent in order to get a good look at what had caused Astor to cry out. I approached the tent and focused on the object in the dirt. When I could clearly see what it was, I recoiled in disgust. It was a squirrel's skull. And not just the skull, to be precise. The entire skeleton was there as well, laid out in a sickening pose that made it appear to be dancing. It looked exactly like the squirrel skeleton that we'd seen on the first night, except this skeleton was clean. Its bones were bright white and did not have a single speck of dirt on them, as if somebody had rigorously scrubbed each and every one, carefully making sure that any impurities were removed, leaving a shiny white pile of bones perfectly laid out in front of Astor's tent. Astor continued to gasp in horror and disgust as Tony stepped out of our tent and walked towards us with a concerned look on his face. "What's wrong? What's going on?" he asked. Astor wrenched her gaze from the skeleton and looked at Tony as he approached. The expression on her face turned from terror to anger. "What's wrong? What's wrong?" Astor screamed hysterically. "As if you don't fucking know." Tony looked confused. He stood next to me and peered down at the ground, seeing the skeleton for the first time. "You're such a freaking asshole, Tony. I thought we made up last night. You said you were sorry for blaming me. What a fucking liar. Fuck you." Well, I absolutely agreed with Astor. It was one thing for Tony to be paranoid and believe that he'd been pushed into the fire, but now he'd taken things too far. Taking the squirrel skeleton that he'd tormented Astor with earlier and placing it outside her tent was cruel. It seemed clear to everyone that he'd done so in a petty attempt to exact revenge for the perceived assault Astor had committed. Well, I became angry, extremely angry. I turned to Tony, and I was about to tell him off, to go on a tirade against him, to cuss him out for being such a thoughtless, paranoid asshole. I opened my mouth to begin my rant, then immediately closed my lips and swallowed my words when I saw his face. He'd taken a step backwards from the skeleton. His face had gone pale and his hands were clenched into tight fists. I could see the tension in his arms and neck. He was afraid. Truly, sincerely afraid. Astor continued to curse at Tony, and after several moments he turned his wide eyes towards Astor and looked her in the face. All he could manage was a barely audible squeak. I didn't do this," Tony whispered as his voice cracked. "Oh, sure you didn't," Astor replied sarcastically. "No, that skeleton just walked up here on its own and sat itself down in front of my tent. You're a lying asshole, that's all you are, a lying asshole." Asta ran back into her tent sobbing. Margaret said nothing and only scowled at Tony before returning to the tent to console Asta. And in that moment, I became afraid. Tony wasn't lying. There was genuine fear etched across his face. He hadn't placed that skeleton outside of Asta and Margaret's tent. That I felt sure of. I sure as hell hadn't put the skeleton there, and Asta clearly didn't. She wouldn't so much as touch such a thing. That left only Margaret, but what motive did she have? She never liked practical jokes, and this had far exceeded what was appropriate for a joke. I knew Tony was having the same thoughts that I was. He turned towards me and opened his mouth, but before he could speak, I shook my head and said, "Don't look at me. I didn't put it there." Tony's face grew whiter. He gave a short nod of understanding and went back to our tent, mumbling something about getting breakfast ready. I stepped into the girl's tent and tried to help calm Asta down. I told her that I honestly thought Tony hadn't put the skeleton there, but she could not be reasoned with. In between bouts of crying, she merely kept repeating, "Somebody put it there. Somebody put it there." The rest of the day went by without more incidents, but the damage had already been done. Asta refused to speak to Tony and hardly left the tent. Margaret again suggested that we cut the trip short, and this time I agreed. I was unsettled, to say the least, and wanted nothing more than to get the hell out of this place. There was something going on here, something not good, and I didn't care to find out what it was. That evening we ate our dinner in silence. Asta remained in her tent and spoke to only Margaret. Before the sun had set, we were all in our tents, attempting to fall asleep. The plan was to wake at the crack of dawn, pack up our supplies and leave. Nobody wanted to stay here any longer. As I laid in the tent next to Tony, wrapped in my sleeping bag and waiting for sleep to take hold, my mind wandered in the manner that minds are prone to do. For a moment, just a brief moment, I allowed my mind to consider the unthinkable. He likes groups of people, groups he can play with. He taunts them like a cat taunts a mouse before killing it. And the more the people suffer before they die, the more power he gets. That was what the old man, Walter Mxngled, had said, wasn't it? Well, here they were, a group of 4 people out in the woods, and there was certainly suffering going on. Tony's hand looked like a fried lobster. Asta was an emotional wreck that couldn't stop sobbing. Margaret and Asta were angry at Tony, and Tony and I were scared to death because we knew that we had not put the skeleton outside that tent. I shivered and pushed the thought away. Here I was, letting an old man's ghost story get to me. But no matter how hard I tried, I couldn't push it away completely. The subtle fear remained, the constant "what if" in the back of my mind. I remembered what Asta had kept repeating this morning. Somebody put it there. And what had Tony said the day before? Somebody pushed me. Somebody, or something. And with that thought, sleep took me. There exists a sound so monstrous, so utterly horrid, that no human ear should ever suffer through it. The sound that woke me from my uneasy sleep and infected my soul, spreading absolute terror throughout every limb. The moment I heard it, my entire body went numb. I was paralyzed with fear, truly paralyzed. I couldn't move my body. To twitch even a muscle was a task as impossible as gliding through the air like a bird. No words in the English language exist that can describe this sound. The closest description I can give is the noise of 100 bloodthirsty wolves howling at the moon, sent through an audio distorter such as the kind used at rock concerts, and then played back at maximum volume. The ground beneath my sleeping bag vibrated, and it felt as if the hounds of hell walked the earth around me. Such was the sound that ended my slumber. I felt Tony next to me, as rigid as I was. I couldn't so much as move my lips to cry out in fear. No sooner had the sound started before it ended, leaving behind a horrible silence. Then a new sound took its place. Much quieter, much less bone-chilling, but horrible nonetheless. It was the sound of Margaret's screams. I suddenly snapped out of my paralysis. My body was free again. I felt Tony bolt upright next to me. My left hand went down to the tent floor next to my sleeping bag, blindly searching for my flashlight. I always kept a flashlight right beside my sleeping bag, and my hand finally found it. I grabbed it, switched it on, and ran out of the tent. Fire. That was the first thing I saw. The brown summer grass around us was on fire. I knew we'd left embers smouldering in the fire pit before we retired to our tents, but there was at least 5 feet of dirt surrounding the pit. Embers could not have accidentally started this blaze. I looked across from our tent and saw that Margaret and Asta's tent had collapsed. I ran straight towards it, running through the smoking, fiery grass that surrounded us. Margaret's wails continued, but they seemed to be getting further away. Asta was still in the tent, thrashing around and yelling for help. I got to the tent and picked up the fabric, allowing Asta to exit. When I raised the tent back up, I saw that the back side of it had been torn to shreds. 4 long gash marks ran across the entire side. "He got her! He took Margaret! He took her!" Asta cried. Her words were barely understandable through her hysterical sobs of terror. I shone my flashlight over the tent and across the clearing, and my blood ran cold. Margaret screamed as she was dragged across the ground. She was being pulled feet first into the forest, her head scraping against the rough, stony ground. I caught only a brief glimpse of the thing that held her leg. It was dark, pure black. It was a person, or a beast, or both, I couldn't tell. It had no defined form. It was like a shadow, except even less than a shadow. It had no substance, no depth. It looked like a 2-dimensional drawing of a dark monster. Margaret disappeared into the pine forest, but her screams continued. Somehow, through all the fear, the terror, and the shock I felt, I was still able to run. A sort of blind fury overtook me. Now I wasn't just afraid. Now I was angry. Angry that thing that tormented my friends and I had taken Margaret from her tent as she slept. I sprinted, faster than I'd ever sprinted before. I sprinted after Margaret. Forgot about Tony, forgot about Asta. The only thing that mattered was saving Margaret from the dark beast that had her. I tore across the clearing and into the trees, following Margaret's screams. I held my flashlight ahead of me. I could see her. She was still being dragged across the forest floor. I willed my legs to pump faster. I ducked under branches, leapt over logs, and narrowly avoided crashing into trees. Yet no matter how hard I worked my legs, no matter how much energy I expended in pursuit of the unknown beast, Margaret grew further and further away. After a while, I could only see her head, still being smacked by the uneven ground. Soon, even her head disappeared, and I had only her screams to guide me. But those grew even fainter, and I realized that I would not be able to save her. When I couldn't run any longer, I stopped and bent over, gasping for air. Margaret's screams continued to grow more and more distant, and abruptly they ceased altogether. My head perked upwards. I strained my ears, but I heard nothing. The forest was completely still. I was alarmed. If Margaret were still screaming, that meant she was alive. But now there was only silence, meaning... I shook my head. I refused to let my mind consider that gruesome possibility. But deep down, in the back of my mind, I knew what had happened to Margaret. I just couldn't admit it to myself. I started jogging forward, calling out her name in a hoarse voice. "Margaret! Margaret! Where are you?" I cried out. I suddenly noticed a new noise, one that wasn't there before. It was a sound of running water. I realized that I must be near the small stream that we'd visited 2 days before. Picking up my pace, I walked towards the sound of the stream. My flashlight illuminated the path ahead, and I saw moving water. And then I saw Margaret. She was laying face down in the stream. Her black hair was waving gracefully in the eddies of the water. "Margaret!" I yelled as I sprinted towards her. As soon as I got within 5 feet of her, I stopped. The bright flashlight beam lit up her entire body. There were cuts and bruises along her legs and arms, and her clothes were tattered. Her right leg had 4 large cuts along it, no doubt where the beast had been holding her. And her head was bashed in. A large rock laid next to the stream. It had bits of skin and brain on it, where it had been used to crush her temple. One look into her eyes told me there was no life there. A current of blood had started washing down the stream. Margaret was dead. That thing, that beast straight out of Walter McNeil's story, had crushed her skull. For a few seconds I stood motionless, my flashlight focused on the lifeless body of my friend. Then I took a step backwards, turned around and ran. It got Margaret. It got Margaret. This was all I could think as I sprinted back towards the clearing. He got Margaret. Now he's going to get us. We have to get away. The light from the grass fire guided me back towards the clearing. After seemed what like an eternity of sprinting, it was probably just a few minutes, I arrived back at camp. Well, dry grass burns quickly, and the fire had mercifully burnt out in the time I'd been gone. Asta and Tony were huddled next to the ruined tent. Asta was rocking back and forth, and Tony sat next to her in a daze. His eyes were unfocused and foggy. I approached them, and they turned to look at me. "Get up. Now. We have to go," I ordered. "Where's Margaret?" Tony asked in a voice that sounded very far away. "Margaret's gone. Let's go." It was a considerable effort to keep my voice calm. "Gone? What do you mean, gone?" Asta cried out. "She's fucking gone. Now get up and go." Well, this seemed to motivate Tony. He jumped to his feet and bolted towards the path that led back to Walter's house. I struggled to help Asta stand. Her knees were too weak to support her weight, and she had to lean on my shoulder. "Tony, wait," Asta sobbed. "Just let him go. We need to leave. Now, walk with me," I commanded her. Slowly but surely we managed our way towards the path. My eyes darted back and forth, searching for any danger, any sign of it. My anger was back. It had killed my friend, one of my best friends since childhood, and I hated it for that. I hated it with all my soul. But now was not the time for hate. I needed to ensure our survival. Margaret was gone, but we could still save ourselves. We entered the dark trail. I held my flashlight in my left hand as my right side supported Asta. The dirt path took a sharp curve, and we rounded it as quickly as we could. When we came fully around the corner, the bright beam of my light from my flashlight revealed a grisly sight. Tony was up in one of the pine trees. His feet dangled about 4 feet from the ground. He'd been completely impaled on the many branches that grew from the tree. Thinner, weaker branches had snapped off, but the thicker, sturdier ones had held strong and penetrated his body. He'd been forced completely up to the trunk of the tree. One branch protruded directly through the center of his neck. Another stuck out through the right side of his chest, revealing a horribly bent ribcage. His head hung downwards at an odd angle, and all the pine needles nearby were speckled with blood, and a steady drip, drip, drip could be heard as warm liquid spilled from his fresh corpse. I felt puke climb into my throat, and I forced it back down. I grabbed Asta by the arm and gave her a rough pull. "Just keep walking. Don't look at him," I said in a shaky voice. But Asta wouldn't move. She stood rooted to the spot, her face deathly white and her eyes wide with shock. "Asta, we need to go now. We can still get away," I pleaded with her. She took 2 steps toward the body of Tony, and then ran the other way. "Stop! You're running the wrong way!" I cried out as I began to chase her. She didn't seem to hear me. Panic had taken hold of her, and no amount of instructions or logic could get through to her. I tore after her, but I was already exhausted from chasing after Margaret, and I couldn't keep up. Well, Asta had always been a better runner than me. She sprinted across the camp clearing in a blind panic as I begged her to stop. When she disappeared into the woods at the opposite end of the camp, I followed her in. I ran after Asta in the same way I'd run after Margaret. I called out her name and asked her to wait. I had a sudden, terrible realization. Asta was in complete panic mode, following no clear path. The ridge we were upon was only about 100 yards wide and had steep cliffs on both ends. With the overhead foliage blocking the moon and stars, a person who was running quickly might not see the edge in time to stop completely. I put my head down and ran faster than I'd ever run before. Asta seemed to be slowing down now, perhaps becoming tired. I was gaining on her, but now I saw something else through the trees ahead. Stars. My gut sank when I realized that my fears had been correct. The cliff was no more than 20 yards in front of Asta. I was at least 10 yards behind her. I put in every bit of energy I still had into running after her, and screamed, "Asta, you're going off the cliff!" Asta understood the danger now, but it was too late. She attempted to stop herself, but her shoes slipped on the rocky ground and she tumbled forward. I slowed down as fast as I could, no more than 2 feet from the edge of the cliff. I reached out my hand and swiped at Asta's torso, attempting to grab her arm. My hand smacked against her shoulder, hard, and spun her around, but I had nothing to grab onto. Her terrified eyes met mine, and she opened her mouth to scream. But her scream was taken by the wind, and she was gone. I stood on the edge of the cliff. I didn't dare look over the side. Oh shit. Oh shit, oh shit. I was all alone now. All of my friends were gone. I was alone in the forest. Alone with it. Somehow I still had the energy to run. I ran back towards camp as fast as my legs could carry me. I was determined to escape, to survive. Through all this, I still had my flashlight. It was a miracle I hadn't dropped it. I arrived back at the clearing. The grass fire had completely gone out. I made a straight line for the path that led out of the campgrounds, a swell of panic rising in my stomach. But something stood in my way, directly in the entrance to the path. It was Tony. Tony stood in the path. His body had been taken down from the pine. The branches through his throat and chest were still there. They'd been snapped off from the tree. Blood still ran from the open wounds on his body. Behind him, I could see it. The thing that had dragged Margaret to her death. The thing that had impaled Tony upon the tree. The black, two-dimensional being that had terrorized us. Strangely, it was somehow transparent. I could see it, but I could also see everything behind it. It held Tony's body up like a puppet. His head lolled to one side and then turned upwards and looked at me with blank, dead eyes. Tony's mouth curved into a grin, but it was not a grin of his own. It looked as if his cheeks had merely been forced upwards by an outside force. And then Tony laughed. Well, it wasn't a real laugh. It sounded as if air was simply being forced through his mangled vocal cords by the thing holding him up. His smile dropped, and then he spoke. Except it wasn't Tony speaking. It was that thing speaking through Tony. The voice was so garbled that I could hardly understand it, but I made out a single word. Run. The thing dropped Tony's body on the dirt path and disappeared. Tony crumpled into a heap of useless flesh. It looked like an action figure that some angry toddler had crushed and stomped into the ground. It had told me to run, but Tony's body in the center of the path sent another clear message. Don't take the trail. And so, I ran. I ran into the woods next to the path. I planned on turning back towards the trail when I could, determined to make my way out of this forest from hell. But there it was, right beside me. It followed along with me, keeping pace with me. Every time I tried to turn in the direction of the path, it was there. It wasn't going to let me escape. Like a dog herding sheep, it ran beside me. It kept itself between me and the trail, ensuring that I could not make my way onto the dirt that led to safety. I absolutely knew that if I ever crossed its path, I'd be dead. I had no choice but to continue straight ahead, through the thick forest of pines. It had changed now. It had taken on a more definite form. It was no longer transparent, but pure black, as it had been when it had taken Margaret. It was a beast with 4 long, thin legs that ended in huge claws. Its snout was lengthy and pointed, and its back was horribly arched. It lumbered alongside me, mad with thirst for the kill. I looked ahead and saw stars. I was nearing the other edge of the ridge. If I didn't change direction soon, I'd go over the edge just as Astra had. I curved my path to the left, away from the trail. But it was there too. It had disappeared from my right side and appeared on my left, continuing to herd me straight ahead. There was only one direction it wanted me to go. Oh, he taunts him, like a cat taunts a mouse before killing it. The words of Walter Mxngled echoed through my mind as I ground to a halt mere inches from the cliff. I turned around to face the horror that pursued me. My mind was completely empty. I had no more sense left in me. There was nothing I could do to protect myself. It stayed in the trees, several feet from the edge of the ridge, prowling back and forth like a giant cat as its hideously long claws scraped against the rocks on the ground. I didn't dare try to run anymore. Every potential path of escape was blocked. I saw its mouth open wide to reveal a set of monstrous black teeth. It curled back onto its hind legs and looked like a spring that was waiting to be set loose. Its hind legs thrust forward with enormous power, and it leapt at me from the trees. Sharp teeth bit into my chest as it crashed into my torso and took me over the ledge. Walter Mxngled awoke with the sun creeping over the horizon. He hadn't slept well, not well at all. Halfway through the night he'd heard something awful, a horrible noise that seemed to come from the direction of the camp where those kids were staying. Well, he thought he'd dreamt it, but he wasn't completely sure. Stepping out onto his front porch, he pulled a cigarette from his pocket and lit it. He felt uneasy. He couldn't quite place his finger on it, but something was throwing him off. For some reason on this morning, he felt drawn to it. Drawn to that damn stairway that stood so defiantly over the ridge. Perhaps it was the horrible noise that had awakened him in the night. Perhaps it was the fact that there was no smoke creeping up over the nearby campgrounds, as it had the past 2 mornings while those kids were camping. Walter walked along the short, narrow path that led to the stairway. The rising sun illuminated it, and to him it was beautiful. It looked just like it had when he was a boy. It was exactly how he remembered it. Walter placed his foot on the first step and began climbing. In his mind, he counted the steps. 1, 2, 3, 4. Any other man would be afraid to do such a thing, to climb out on an impossible stairway over a large cliff that looked as if it would fall over at any moment. But Walter knew he was safe. It had been there for 900 years and hadn't fallen over. At least, that's what those archaeologists claimed. And he climbed out on it when he was a boy, hadn't he? It hadn't fallen over then. No, the stairway would not falter to the weight of Walter Mxngled. It had been there when he was born, and it would remain long after he died. Walter hesitated before taking the last step. Carefully he raised himself onto it and peered out over the valley. It was a beautiful view, better than the one he'd enjoyed from his porch. The sun illuminated the valley below in a splendid swirl of colors. But instantly, a darkness came over him. His skin tightened up and goosebumps broke out over his arms. This place was no good. He could feel that. For the first time in his life, he could tell that the stairway was not something he should disturb. Walter quickly rushed down the steps, taking them 2 at a time. It wasn't until he was back on the trail to his house that he felt better, when the sense of darkness finally left him. He laughed out loud in the morning air. What an old fool he was, scared of a stupid hunk of rock that some crazy Indians built 1,000 years ago. Nevertheless, his mind returned to that feeling of dread that had overcome him on the top step of the stairway. He thought back to the story he'd told those kids a few days before. Walter shuddered and decided not to think about it any longer. He'd lived in that house for nearly 50 years and had not a single whiff of the supernatural. Because it doesn't go after individual people, only groups. His subconscious goaded him. He shoved the thought out of his mind. That ridiculous story came from a superstitious old drunkard. It wasn't even worth considering. Yeah, stairway to heaven, my ass. But in his heart he knew that nothing could completely wash away the fear he now felt towards that place. The fear that had invaded his soul and taken root, like a weed, as soon as he arrived at the final step of the stairway. He could ignore it, rationalize it, explain it away as best he could, but the seed of doubt would never leave. Kids these days can't even count right. What good school anyways, he thought to himself. Yeah, that's it. They just miscounted. Couldn't see it right in the setting sun. That's what happened. That must be it, he said out loud, attempting to console himself. Yeah, that must be it. Because there were exactly 40 steps on that damn stairway. In your nightmares, I will live. This story was inspired by the song Hallowed Be Thy Name by Iron Maiden. The idea for the story is also inspired by Johnny Frank Garrett, who was executed in Huntsville, Texas in 1992. James Anderson III stared down at a stainless steel table smudged with greasy fingerprints from God knows how many doomed inmates before him. Sitting unceremoniously on top of the table was a greyish-white plastic plate filled to its edges with a diner-style breakfast platter. It included 3 fried eggs over easy, overdone, grits with butter, ice cold, 3 strips of bacon, undercooked, hash browns, overcooked, and 2 pieces of toast cut into triangles. A single pack of butter and a single jelly labeled fruit medley sat on top of the cold toast. James stared at it a while longer. The thought of putting any of it into his mouth and swallowing made his stomach turn thrice over. The last meal. The last practical joke of his life. You'd have to be completely insane to have an appetite at a time like this, he thought. The only reason he chose the plate of grease as his farewell dinner was because it reminded him of happier times with his family. The only happy memories he could recall were the ones of him and his little sister. When they were kids and his mom had a little extra money, she'd take them to the diner at the edge of town. They'd sit at the counter and his sister, Sarah, would get waffles with powdered sugar and syrup. Sometimes the cook would sprinkle chocolate chips on them, and she'd have a grin from ear to ear, arranging the little chocolate morsels into eyes, a mouth, and a nose to make a friendly waffle-faced creature on her plate. James always got the working man special, to seem more like an adult. Came with fried eggs that bled a rich, creamy yolk when poked, crispy bacon, hash browns, and a thick stack of toast with butter and jam. In truth, he often looked longingly at his sister's waffle plate, but he had concluded that only babies ordered that kind of stuff, and at 12, he thought of himself as nearly a man. Those times were worlds and worlds away. The reality was that being a man had turned out to be one big, sick joke. A curse, he thought now, looking at his last meal. The platter in front of him, all these years and worlds later, was a poor imitation of the breakfast he remembered from the diner. James stared some more, eyes widening at the thought of his younger self and the long, tortuous path he'd walked to get where he was today. "Not even going to take a bite?" the guard asked from his post at the doorway. James shook his head slowly back and forth. "And after all the trouble we put into making you a special dinner, talk about gratitude," the guard said. James knew he was trying to get a reaction out of him. The guard hated him. They all hated him. Everyone looked at him like a piece of shit on the sidewalk, like something disgusting and unwanted, a smudge upon their good, clean world. The guard knocked on the glass of the closed door, signaling someone to come and take him back to his cell. James was glad for it. The smell of the congealing food was making him sicker by the minute. "Minutes," he thought. "How many do I have left?" Another guard entered, unlocked the chain from the steel chair that was attached to James's handcuffs, and walked him out of the door and into the hallway. He walked down the hallway and could see the other inmates in their cells, staring out at him with faces like floating masks. One was a grotesquely exaggerated mask of sorrow. Another was a fool's mask, cross-eyed and deranged. The fool laughed at him as he walked by. Another looked like a devil, reaching through the bars at him. The guard slammed his nightstick on the bars of the cell and the inmate jumped back, his face returning to normal. James stared at him as he walked by. They locked eyes, and the inmate, a middle-aged white man with thinning grey hair and a wiry build, ran his thumb horizontally across his neck and then waved goodbye. James was taken back to his cell to wait for the audience to arrive. He was sentenced to death by a lethal injection, and it was to be carried out on that day, June 10th, 1992. The guard locked the cell door and looked through the bars at him. "Today's a beautiful day for killing scumbags," he said before walking away with a little spring in his step. James wondered if they really believed he was guilty. He was an innocent man. He'd only been a teenager when he was first jailed, accused of horrible things. Sometimes at night, he tried to imagine doing those things that they'd said he did, and he couldn't. Sometimes the world twists in ways that make you question your reality, he thought. Maybe I'm crazy. Maybe I did do it. He put his head in his hands and was surprised to find that he had more tears to cry. He let them out, almost savoring the sensation. Everything was his last. What would be the last thing he saw? What would be his last thought? He wanted it to be about his mother and sister. He'd planned to close his eyes in that final moment and imagine an alternate reality, one in which his father hadn't died when he was 4 and his mother had never gotten remarried to a man who'd repeatedly abused him and his sister. In this alternate world, James had gone to college and met a girl, and they'd both worked hard to build a life together. They'd have one daughter, maybe, who he would name Sarah after his sister. They'd buy a little house somewhere, maybe even in another state. He would move his sister and his mother to Maine, maybe. He'd never been there, but his father had, and he'd shown him pictures when he was a little boy. It seemed like a beautiful place. They'd live there in a little cottage and smell the pine trees and the salty sea and be happy. He would picture that life from beginning to end as they injected him with a poison that would kill him. Maybe death would take him there if he was lucky. James was pulled out of his fantasy by footsteps approaching his cell. They were heavy and slow. He didn't recognize them. Well, he knew the sound of all the guards' footsteps, and these didn't match. They got louder until a pair of old, worn-out penny loafers stopped in front of his cell. James looked at the shoes and then scanned up to the faded corduroy pants, the pot belly stretching the buttons of a beige button-down shirt, a brown and yellow striped tie, and tweed jackets, and finally up to the round head of the man. His thin lips were mostly hidden by a greying moustache. His nose was round and red with long, dark hairs poking out. His eyes, greenish-brown, shone out at James from behind a pair of wire-rimmed glasses. "Hello, James," the man said, and smiled guiltily at having intruded on his solitude. "My name is Mr. Archon. I just have a wee bit of paperwork here for you to sign before the big event," he said, while rooting through a pile of papers in a folder. He looked at the grim look on James's face and corrected himself. "Well, that is to say your execution, to be frank." "Hey, what do you know? That's my first name. Call me Frank if you like," he said with a self-conscious chuckle. "You a lawyer?" James said, mostly just to say anything. He wasn't expecting to see anyone else before they took him to the execution room. As if in response to his question, the cell door slid open with a metallic clang. Mr. Archon stepped into the room and the door slid closed behind him. James was surprised the guards would use the automatic unlock system for this. He assumed an unarmed civilian to visit his cell, but here he was, stepping into the cell of a supposed murderer without the slightest hesitation. The rest of the cell block was eerily silent. James had gotten used to the continuous sound of shouting, jeering, begging, and quite often praying. He wondered who they thought they were praying to. The guilty had no business asking for mercy, and the innocent had obviously been left to rot by either a pitiless god or the absence of any god at all. James believed the latter was more likely. What kind of god would deal out a fate like this? Sick joke indeed. "James Anderson III, yes indeed," Mr. Archon said as he found the paper he was looking for. He pushed his glasses up onto his stubby nose again and again as they slid down relentlessly towards the paper. "Well, Mr. Addison, I am not a lawyer, but a clerk of the state sent to tie up the loose ends of your case." "Well, with all due respect, Mr. Frank, my case has so many loose ends, I'd be surprised if you could tie them up in the few minutes I have left." Mr. Archon looked at James with an almost comically exaggerated expression of pity. He pouted his bottom lip out and shook his head. "Oh, what a world we live in that deals out such a fate to a young man such as yourself. It really is a shame to meet you under such bleak circumstances. But alas, here we are, and there are still a few things we can accomplish before your time comes to an end." Mr. Archon shuffled over to the metal bed and sat down, laying his battered briefcase on its side. He popped the latches and shuffled through another mound of disorganized paperwork, whistling a tune as he searched. James stood there, staring at the man, feeling that familiar wave of unreality wash over him. This could all be a bad dream, he thought. Mr. Archon's whistling took on a strange tone as the notes lilted up and down in a sad melody that he recognized from somewhere. He closed his eyes and remembered his 13th birthday party. He just turned 13 years old. He was sitting in his bedroom, waiting for his mum to get home from work. That summer, she'd taken up a job cleaning houses, and he spent a lot of time alone. At the time, she was also married to her second husband, Tom. Tom was a traveling salesman that was often on the road, which was a-okay with James. Tom was a bad man. It was the only way his young brain had been able to put into words what kind of a monster Tom was. He told his mum one time that Tom was a bad man, and she hadn't believed him. She said he had to stop reading those pulp comics. "They're turning your brain to mush," she shouted defensively. But it wasn't the comics that had ruined his brain. It was the bad things that a bad man named Tom had been doing. On that day of his 13th birthday, Tom had come home to surprise James with a gift. He came whistling up the walkway, whistling into the house, and whistling up the stairs to James's bedroom door. It was a slow, cascading tune that turned James's blood to ice. "James, the birthday boy," Tom said outside the door with a flourish of little knocks. Tom opened the door and stood there in his shabby tweed jacket and faded corduroys, holding a wrapped gift. James sat frozen on the bed, hoping he'd turn to stone and be unbreakable. He'd hoped for that many times before, and sadly, he'd remained flesh and bone. Tom sat on the bed next to him, smiling like a lunatic. "Go on, open it," he said. "Mom will be home soon. I'll open it when she gets home," James had whispered, never taking his eyes off his shoes. His mind was already separating from his body, taking him to the alternate reality that he'd dreamed of every day since his father had died. "Be a good boy and open it now," Tom said with a sudden biting intensity. He pushed the hair back from James's forehead and stroked his cheek. James's consciousness had blessedly floated up to the ceiling to watch the horror from afar, as it had done during the previous visits Tom made to his room when his mother wasn't around. "Here we are, Mr. Anderson," Mr. Archon said gleefully, with the paper clutched in his chubby fist. James opened his eyes to find himself back in the cell. "Be a good boy and sign right here for me, please." He held out the crumpled paper in one hand and a pen in the other. James stared at the man in his cell. With dawning horror, he realized that he was looking at an aged version of his stepfather, Tom. He jumped back against the cell door, clutching himself tightly as he had as a child, trying to turn to stone. Now, James, there's no reason to be frightened. It's just a simple form stating that you're a very bad man who's done very bad things." "You're dead. I saw it in the paper. You died 15 years ago. You're dead," James whispered, clutching himself tighter. His whole body shook. Mr. Archon's smile widened. His eyes, which had seemed greenish-brown before, looked yellow now. His glasses slid down his sweaty nose again, and those dead, yellow eyes stared nakedly at James's terrified face. They were the eyes of a corpse. "I'm not dead, James. You're dead. Dead as a doornail." He cackled and threw back his head with glee at his own cleverness. The thing that called itself Frank Archon stood up, and James watched in sick horror as his bloated, purple belly expanded. The smell of decay filled the cell. James turned and gripped the bars, pressing his face against them to look for a guard. "Help! Help me!" James screamed into a silent hallway. A hand gripped his shoulder, and he screamed again. He turned around and looked into the face of his mother. "James!" she sobbed. She stepped back towards the bed and picked up one of the crumpled pieces of paper from Mr. Archon's pile. James looked wildly around the cell. There was no sign of the Mr. Archon Tom creature. He looked back at his mother, who was wearing one of her old house dresses. Her greying hair was coming loose from her usually neat bun. She looked very old and tired. She was looking at the piece of paper with her hand over her mouth. aghast. "Oh, James, how could you?" she said. "Mom, what are you doing in here? What's happening?" he screamed, shaking and crying. "Breaking and entering? Rape? Murder? Why did you do that to that old woman? How could you?" she said, backing away from him, shaking her head. "You know I didn't do any of that. You know that. They framed me," he shouted back at her. "Your sister is so disappointed in you," she said. No, James said, sliding down the bars to the floor. "Oh, I'm a statue made of stone. Nothing can break me," he thought desperately. He cupped his elbows and made himself small, shuddering and gasping for air. "Oh God, someone stop this. Someone help me," he said quietly to no one. "Why won't anyone help me?" he screamed. There was no reply. The silence engulfed him. He felt paralyzed in fear and sorrow, and for a moment he believed he really had turned to stone, a marble monument to his suffering. Here stood a boy who was fed nothing but pain, and in payment he was handed a death sentence for heinous crimes he did not commit. Justice is dead. Life is a sick joke. The end. An eternity passed, and the silence coaxed James out of his paralysis. He opened his eyes. A woman sat on his bed. A stranger. Her presence calmed him. She was young and beautiful. Her green eyes glowed out of a face with sharp, comely features. Her dark hair cascaded past her shoulders, shiny and smooth. She wore an expensive-looking black suit, tailored to perfection. She had one leg crossed over the other, and a foot with a pointy, black, high-heeled shoe bounced up and down. She looked completely at home and elegant in a jail cell on death row. "What is this? Am I going crazy?" he asked the woman. "No, James. You just took a trip through your own brain," she said with a calm smile. "My mother, she thinks I really did those things," he cried with the heartbreaking strength of a child. "No, dear. She's waiting for you in the audience. She and your sister are heartbroken that you're paying for the sins of someone else. They believe you. I believe you." "But I don't understand," he said. His tears dried up at last, and he sat in stunned silence, waiting for something, anything to make this all stop. "Mr. Archon was Tom. He's dead. He was here," he said. "No, I'm Mr. Archon," she said with the patience of a mother talking to her beloved toddler. "You?" "Yes, James, I'm Mr. Archon. I showed you those things. I don't want you to die without realizing the full extent of your misfortune. I want you to feel the injustice that's been done to you. Your life was worth so much more, and these people took it from you. Tom, the lawyers, the guards, all the people sitting out there waiting excitedly for you to die in front of them." I never did those things. They don't know me," he said. "I know that, my love," she said as she stood up. She reached down with perfectly manicured nails and took his hands in hers. He suddenly felt a warm, spreading joy that he'd never known before rush through him. She pulled him to his feet and looked down at him. She was at least a foot taller than he was. "James," she said as she tilted her head and arched one of her exquisitely dramatic eyebrows, "did you know that when your mother and sister were seated on the family side of the execution room just now, the mob on the other side threw things at them?" "No," he said. "Did you know that one man spat in your sister's face and called her a slut?" No. "Did you know that they're sitting there right now cursing your dear mother and sister for simply being related to a monster such as yourself?" James shook his head, no, and looked down at the floor. He felt his cheeks go hot with the beginning of deep rage. "They're going to cheer when you take your last breath. When you think your last thoughts, they'll be laughing and smiling, and your family will walk out of here humiliated and harassed, probably for the rest of their lives. God, it's not their fault, James said, clenching his teeth. Of course not. It's these people, she said with a voice that echoed in his head through all the years of his life. All the injustices he'd been dealt for simply being born. Wrong place at the wrong time, and here comes the punchline, he thought through a thickening red curtain of anger. James squeezed his eyes shut and clenched his fists tight enough to make his fingernails draw blood in the soft pads of his hands. He gulped in the rancid air of his cell and screamed with every ounce of energy he had left. When the last of the howl had escaped him, he fell to his knees, panting. What can I do? What can I do? He said. Do you believe in immortality? She asked. I don't know what you mean, he said, looking up into her beautiful face. I am the bringer of justice for lost souls. You deserve revenge. What will your last thought be, James? I don't know. I want my family to be happy. No, she said, her eyes flickering like flames. Suddenly James's mind went blank. It was a relief. He could see himself standing in the blackness. Behind him was a figure in a black robe. A rotted hand reached out from beneath the cloak and pointed down. He looked down off a precipice into a never-ending pit of flames. They ebbed and flowed like the sea. Bodies were writhing down there, screaming and screaming. He saw Tom, and the judge that convicted him, and the lawyers that failed him, and all those people who were so excited to see him die. And he smiled at their suffering. Mr. Archon's voice rang out beside him, and he was back in the cell. Your death is inevitable, but a curse will last forever, it said. James could hear the guard's footsteps approaching. It was time. He smiled up at Mr. Archon, and she smiled back. The guard opened the gate and grinned at James. He didn't seem to notice the tall Mr. Archon standing behind him. He put James in handcuffs. Showtime, the guard said, and walked him out of the cell. James looked over his shoulder and smiled at his tall friend, who nodded back at him. Two guards opened the double doors to the holding area of the execution room. James could hear the crowd murmuring on the other side of the wall. His mind was clear. He knew what his last thought was going to be. The head guard nodded to the others, and they took him out to face the audience. A roar of noise erupted as soon as he emerged from behind the curtained area. One side of the room was filled with people screaming at him, their faces red with fury, some with tears and some with smug smiles. On the other side, separated by metal bars, sat his mother and sister. They were the only ones there to mourn him. They were both crying and sat up straight when they saw him. He made eye contact with his sister and gave her a smile. The crowd grew louder at the sight of that. He looked at his mother and mouthed the words, I love you. Devil, bitch, someone shouted at his mother. James turned to the man and saw a flash of him burning in a pit of flames until it was nothing but blackened bones. The bones continued to beg for mercy. The man shrank back at James's stare and shouted no more. The guards walked him over to a gurney. He laid down willingly and stared at the ceiling, feeling as strong as stone as they tied his arms and legs down. Once he was strapped down, the man in charge of the operation, Master of Death, James thought, somewhat amused, asked him if he had any last words. He did. James turned and looked at his audience. My life has been filled with pain and horror. The injustices done to me and my family can never be fully repaid, but I can try. Today I will be put to death for crimes I did not commit. Not only do you condemn me, but you condemn my family, who deserve none of this. I have had a day of lasts. My last meal, my last piss, my last cry, my last conference with demons. I do not mourn my last day on this earth, because I believe in immortality. My body may perish today in front of you, but you will not be rid of me. I curse you. I curse all of you who came to see me die. I curse the ones who worked to take my life away and those of you who did nothing to stop it. I curse the bad men who have hurt me over the years, and I curse this world for being what it is. I curse your blood. I curse every person who is born of your bloodlines. In this curse, I will live on. When you think you've put all this behind you, I'll be the chill that grazes your neck on a dark street. I'll be the fear that creeps up on you and consumes you the last years of your life. I'll be the sickness that takes your wife, your child, your own sinful heart. In your nightmares, I will live. In the deepest pits of your own hell, I will wait for you to join me. I'm immortal in your suffering. Mom, Sarah, I love you and I always will. The rest of you can go to hell. The crowd surged and had to be held back by guards. The needles were inserted into the veins of each arm and the poison injected. James looked at his family one last time and willed them to remember him as a good man. His sister sat up and screamed his name. "James," she sobbed. His mother stood and pulled her close, kissing her head. She looked up at her son. "I love you, my sweet boy," she mouthed to him. James smiled at them both. The sound of the crowd was nothing but background noise to him. He turned his head slowly and looked up at the ceiling, feeling the poison rushing through him. There on the ceiling above him was Mr. Archon. She was up there in the shadows, just a pair of yellow eyes staring at him with joy. James closed his eyes and died, happy that justice had finally prevailed. Hurt. Sharp, blinding slits of light hit my eyes from between darkened clouds of pollution and smoke. It's been years since the world's gone to hell, and I've been in the middle of it for so long, and the only one beside me was my one and only companion. I've considered him my brother for so long, and it's paid me well. I don't bother looking over my shoulder or moving my attention as I finally muttered out, dragging my feet against the dirt-battered cracked pavement that was once a highway. Now, it just leads nowhere. Nowhere important anyways. Most of the highways and main streets led to other opposing gangs and groups that seemed to be more interested in bloodlust than survival. Of course, we were neither of those. We were the ones who kept them in line. Hey! I glanced up to keep my balance, my boots now causing me to stumble a bit every so often as the lip was stuck between the deep cracks. The impenetrable thick clouds of dust and heat made it impossible to be dressed in such a way as we did. Oh, I stopped mid-step, stomping my foot that was still in the air. I rubbed my shoulders a bit, the pistols concealed in my pockets clinking and crushing together. Do you think we're ever going to find him anyways? I turned my head to spit over my shoulder, huffing through my nose with impatience. I heard John sigh, slowly coming to a stop beside me as well. He put a gloved hand on my shoulder, the other hand holding up a small parchment with symbols and scribbles that only he seemed to understand. He let out a stifled laugh, shaking his head. "Listen, Ezra, we've been on this same damn highway for about 3 days on foot. I'm sure we're going to be here for quite a while. At least 3 of them are in a group together, They're pretty far gone. Hell, as much as I know, they might be behind us trying to get to us as well. John moved his hand away to pat my back a bit hard, nearly knocking the wind out of me. I smirked, shaking my head. I couldn't believe it. So, it'll just be one huge loop like that, I joked, starting off once more down the highway. John shrugged a shoulder, raising a brow. I don't know, but could be. Listen, it'll probably only be a few days till we get there. If we're lucky, we'll be there by sunup tomorrow, if we don't sleep. Just hearing this made me instantly dread the thought. Going through all this made me want to dig myself into a hole to let all of this blow over. But that was to be expected with such a job as we had. John stuffed the paper in his back pocket as he trudged on, leaving me to stay ahead. I wrapped my fingers around the edge of my gas mask, tugging it down to place over my face, rolling my shoulders once more. Once we get there, which will be around morning, I'm sure, since I'm not sleeping anytime soon. I chuckled softly, pointing a thumb over my shoulder to him, hopefully grabbing his attention. You'll have to realize how important this is to me. I shoved both my hands into my back pockets, huffing through the mask enough to cause the glasses over my eyes to slick up with fog. I held my breath long enough to have the fog thin enough to see at least a few feet in front of me. I'm pretty sure I do, John snickered, shrugging his shoulders up as he flipped his hood over his head to conceal his bright blonde, almost white hair. He raised a brow, looking up to me with amusement. Ever since I suggested the idea, you were all for it. Yeah, you're right, I chuckled, shrugging my shoulders as well. Don't worry, man, we're gonna... I stopped mid-stride, skidding onto my feet as I noticed something off. John stopped as well, quirking up a brow in curiosity. What? Did I do something wrong? He muttered out, a bit confused. I hissed between my teeth at him to keep quiet, grinding them hard as I jerked my head around. I stared at the ground for a moment, crouching down. Since there was nothing around but desert-like brush, sand, dirt, and pavement, well, aside from the occasional few broken cars, there shouldn't be anything that moved other than him and I. John did the same, his chest moving up and down with his nerves. I did the same. I slowly reached up to gesture his attention to where I was pointing, nodding my head. In a hushed tone, I managed to mutter out, "Someone's here. I can tell." I didn't bother looking to see if John was tagging behind as I slowly walked towards the direction the figure was headed, my palms growing moist with excitement and nerves. As soon as I was a few more steps behind him, he spun around on the heels of his boots, staring directly down to me. I gasped loudly, springing up onto my feet. John did the same, pointing a finger at him. "What are you doing? Don't just stand there." He snapped at me, but I just stared. I slowly reached down to curl a finger around the butt of my pistol, glaring up to the other. I turned my head over my shoulder, but kept eye contact with the man in front of me. John sputtered out a mixed amount of words, mostly nonsense that I couldn't make out, probably because of my indiscreet focus on the new man. "Who is he?" I muttered to John, but just loud enough so the other could hear. The man snickered, clenching and unclenching his fists. In one hand he had a long, thick silver chain that wrapped around his palm and wrist. One end empty, but the other had a large arrowhead-like blade attached to it. Before John could answer my question, the man chuckled. His large, muscled figure made me seem like a stick compared to him, and John no different. He had several piercings along his bottom and upper lip, several trailing down his eyebrow and cheekbones. His fair tan skin seemed to be bleached between the slits of light from between the clouds in the sky. I narrowed my eyes, him doing the same. He didn't seem surprised as I was, which made me feel a bit uneasy on the encounter. Bam! He slowly began to whip the chain up and down with the makeshift blade slicing through the air, a wide yet sly grin on his face. I took a few steps back, John doing the same. I slowly slid the pistol out and ran my thumb along the side, blindly switching the safety off. I raised the barrel up with one hand, the other staying at my side. As coolly as possible, I tried my best to stay calm. "Oh, listen, Ben. I don't want to do this to you." I held my breath, my right eye twitching. "But I'm going to have to unless you put your weapon down right now." I barked at him, but his expression didn't seem to be any different than before. If anything, he seemed more amused than intimidated. He didn't stop rolling his chain, but he raised his opposite hand. He motioned for something behind him to come forward, causing me to almost lose my grip on my pistol. I lowered it slowly, but still kept it aimed in front of me just in case. I raised a brow, now curious on who this mysterious secondary right man was. A taller, lanky female pushed past him, dressed in nearly all black, with stringy, long dark green dyed hair. Her piercing steel-silver eyes seemed to penetrate through mine, leaving me one on two. She combed her bangs away from her eyes with her unnaturally long, sharpened fingernails, her hips swaying with her steps. In one hand she had a painted-over Glock 19, and on her back, held up with a strap, was the heavy AT-4, which to me seemed that it was already loaded and ready to fire whenever the two seemed that they needed it. "And you are?" She raised a brow, shifting her weight. She crossed her arms over her chest, sighing softly. I already knew what she was aiming for, to put me off guard. At least that's the conclusion I jumped to. "My name isn't important right now, ma'am," I said flatly, raising the pistol up as I stared at the Glock in her hand. She sighed softly through her nose, flipping the hair from her eyes. "Sweetie, there's no use to hiding. Everybody knows your name, you know." She snickered, glancing over her shoulder to her partner in crime, shaking her head. She seemed to have some sort of tick about her, like she was hiding something. But, well, I set that idea aside. "You're known as the modern bull around here, sweetheart." She giggled, shrugging her shoulders. "And that's why we were sent to find you." She looked back towards me, and her smile grew ear to ear. "Oh, and kill you." Ban nodded his head in agreement, snickering quietly as well. "By who?" I shifted my weight a bit, squeezing the handle of my pistol gently. The woman scoffed and rolled her eyes, shaking her head in disappointment. "Do you really not remember?" She raised a brow. "You're on that, I don't know, agenda to assassinate those who oppose the laws of the New World." She planted one hand on her hip, raising a brow. I flashed her a disgusted look. How did anybody know that other than John and I? I don't know what you're getting at," I muttered, looking off to the side. "If, you're the people I was sent to, as you say, assassinate, how'd you get so far ahead of us?" She just laughed, taking a few steps forward until she was nearly in my face. She pulled the pistol up close. "Where was John when I needed him?" "John," I called out to him, but as soon as I opened my mouth to speak, she shoved the thick barrel of the pistol into my mouth, my eyes growing wide. I heard John a bit further away yell my name, but I ignored it. He was too far away to help me, so I was alone. Quickly, Ban stepped closer as well, coming to a stop with his chain and arrow. He slid his hand up the chain to hold the arrowhead between his index and thumb, holding it up against my neck. "I know what your kind's up to," he whispered into my ear, snickering. He slowly pressed the blade further, the barrel of the gun slowly pushing further into my mouth. I tried my best to jerk away, but one of her hands was wrapped around the back of my head to keep me still, causing me to squirm violently, trying to get away. All I could do was scream helplessly. But that was when I had a sudden urge to keep moving forward. "Ezra!" John's voice grew louder. "Oh, he must be closer," I thought to myself. I slowly gripped tighter onto my pistol, raising it up to aim at the woman's forehead. Though she was close enough that our noses were almost touching, I could barely fit the gun between us. The end of the gun was pressed against my forehead, as the barrel was against hers. "Ezra, you can't just let him do this. Come on." It almost sounded like an order from him. I closed my eyes tight as I wrapped my index finger around the trigger, inhaling sharply. I tumbled backwards as the gun's whiplash impacted me as much her, a small stream of dark blood trailing from the middle of my forehead down the bridge of my nose and then down to the corner of my mouth. A fine line was just a mere 2 centimeters deep into my skin on my neck from the blade, a small trail of blood trickling down and staining my sun-bleached shirt with a dark red. I raised the gas mask to wipe the blood away from my mouth, the heavy taste of iron making me shiver. I lowered the gas mask back over my face, Ban switching his expression from excited to surprised. Nearly tripping over one of the cracks in the road, I hear John stumble forward and bump into me, but I dared not move. I nearly stumbled forward from my dizziness, but stayed on my feet as steady as I could. "What are you doing? We gotta go!" He pounded against my back and shoulder blades frantically, trying to get me to move, but I was too long gone in thought. "No, these are the ones," I mutter, raising the pistol once more. John stopped almost instantly as he heard, nodding his head slowly. I felt him move away from my back, making me aim better than I had. Ban began to swing the chain as fast as he could, throwing it forward and nearly slicing into me. I shoot without thinking or aiming, something that I wished to never do, but had to. The bullet went clean through the right side of his chest. He made a variety of short, cut-off moans and gasps as he dropped to his knees, one hand on the wound and the other on the chains. He looked up to me, and I stared back down to him. I took a few steps forward and pointed my pistol to the top of his head, causing him to start to hyperventilate. "Oh, God," Ban muttered, squeezing his eyes shut tightly. Must be embarrassing to be taken down like this, huh?" I raised a brow, smirking slightly. I pressed the end of the barrel against his head hard, pushing it down against his skull. He gasped loudly as I stopped midway, making Ban more frustrated than he already was. Just do it already," he groaned, but I didn't let it happen so fast. I slowly raised the pistol from his head, making him look up to me with confusion. I slowly shifted the pistol from my right hand to my left. "What are you doing?" He stopped mid-sentence with a loud pain scream as I curled my index and thumb around the bridge of his nose and pressed my fingernails deep into his eyes, pushing them out one at a time. His screams were satisfying, knowing that I'd finally had the job done and right where I wanted him to be. John tugged at my shoulder hard, but I didn't stop. "Stop, right there. This isn't what I needed." He snapped at me, but he couldn't stop this. I'd been waiting for this for a long time, and now I had him where I wanted. As his mouth was open wide as he'd been screaming, I juggled the 2 dark jade eyes between my fingers in my gloved hand, shoving both deep down his throat. Well, his screaming soon turned into chokes, but I kept his mouth closed with my hands, and both my heels on his wrists so he couldn't move much anymore. Well, some say that this apocalyptic world will get to us. I beg to differ. It makes us stronger. As soon as Ban stopped moving, I slowly moved myself away from him, sighing through my nose. John put a hand on my shoulder, squeezing it gently. I looked over my shoulder to see him, sighing through his nose softly. "Took you long enough," I chuckled softly, flipping my safety back on and putting the pistol back into my pockets. "Great job, man." He smiled his same modest smile, crossing his arms over his chest. "Listen, I'll get back to you once you have more to do. The boss will be happy to know you got it done." "Boss?" I raised a brow, doing the same. Was he just messing with me? "Who's this boss? I thought it was just us." "Oh, you don't know, do you?" John shook his head, sighing. He slowly reached up to slide his pale hood away from his head, his white hair shining brightly, his pale skin and bright blue eyes becoming apparent to me. He tilted his head to the side, sighing softly. He slowly outstretched a hand to me, in which I hesitantly took. While my fingers almost instantly went through his hand. I jerked my hand back, making me jump almost instantly. "What the hell?" I looked down to my hand, then back up to him. He smiled softly, nodding his head. My expression quickly turned from surprise to fury, clenching my teeth tightly. The only thing that he said, out of a million other things, the thing that made me furious the most, were a simple 5 words that would haunt me to this day. "I'm all in your mind, Ezra. I am God." This story is based on Like a Stone by Audioslave. A final goodbye. I waited in a local cafe situated above one of the many subway stations that cut their way beneath downtown New York. It seemed like she'd been waiting forever for her beloved niece, Avery, to arrive. It had been so long since she'd seen her niece that, she didn't want to think about how lonely she'd been without her. She didn't want to remember the day that Avery had left her, those many years ago. Avery had come to live with Naya at the age of 3 when her own mother could no longer take care of her. Naya's sister Helen had struggled with her alcohol addiction for years. Naya always had the feeling she'd end up raising her niece one day if Helen didn't clean up her act, and, well, she was right. She claimed the custody of her niece when she was 3 years old, under the instruction of a city attorney. Somehow her niece had gone missing from her life after only 2 years of raising her as her own child. Little Avery was only 5 years old when she disappeared into the vast oceans of people and buildings that gave New York its reputation of swallowing faint-hearted people alive. Naya's sister never forgave her for losing sight of her. Now, New York is a big city. Many items have been lost to its streets, parks and alleys never to be recovered. It was a city where things and people disappeared in a flash of a second, and neither was easily found. Despite this fact, Naya always thought she would find Avery. She always hoped she would see her playing outside one of the downtown shops when she was running errands for the law firm she worked at. Avery would run up to her giggling, and Naya would take her home to her apartment where she'd make sure that she would never lose sight of her again. She always imagined that she could see her when she took long strolls in Central Park, engrossed in thoughts about the times they'd once shared together. Now Naya was so mixed up inside. She didn't know whether she was happy or frightened to see the person she loved like a daughter again after 4 years of being apart. Little Avery would be 9 years old now. One of the regulars of the cafe told her that she saw her niece hanging around the lobby a few days ago. Naya had posted her picture on the walls with her name and address in the hope that someone would find her. Well, Avery looked older, but the man who found her niece said he would have recognized her facial features anywhere from the picture she'd posted. Naya came to the cafe every night since the regular had told her the details of her niece's whereabouts, in the hope of finding her again. Well, she would do anything to have her niece in her arms after spending so many years apart. She was tired of living her life alone. She was tired of the guilt that she'd been lugging around for 5 years from losing her. Her sister's inebriated curse words stuck out the most in her mind. "I hate that you're my sister. I hate you more than anyone. Damn you, I hope you rot in hell." The drunken words that Helen had screamed at her the night her daughter went missing often played over and over like a broken record in Naya's mind. They made her hate herself more and more the longer she was apart from her niece. She made her want to curl up somewhere and let herself waste away to nothing. She'd felt worthless ever since she'd heard them. She couldn't face her sister ever since the loss in both of their lives had taken place. Tonight the service was slow, and when the waitress did speak to her, the young woman with red hair, pulled into a ponytail, told her that she would meet her niece soon. Naya had talked to the regular at the cafe who'd originally seen her niece, and said that she'd also seen Avery playing by the subway a few times as well. The regular at the cafe insisted that she'd seen Avery hanging around these parts since last August, but Naya had yet to see her walk through the glass doors of the small establishment. She'd been waiting for her niece to show up for a while now, and somehow found the courage to pull herself out of her depressive haze, if only for a while, at the prospect of seeing Avery walk through the front entrance. Perhaps this evening would be the moment when she could finally own up to the fact that there were some things in this world that were out of her hands and could not be faced alone. She couldn't explain why she was waiting here. She felt completely disoriented. One minute she was driving home, and the next moment, she wasn't sure what happened. Naya assumed that she'd stopped at this place because she knew Avery would be here. Maybe she possessed some kind of ESP. Naya remembered that her sister told her once that all aunts have psychic abilities that tell them when their family needs them most. That was one of the many things that made aunts special. Helen had told her that gem of wisdom before Avery had gone missing from their lives. Naya knew that her sister would say that all family is worthless if they had the same conversation these days. Well, Helen had lost her last reason to retain some sort of sanity in her life when her daughter went missing. She started knocking back 8 beers a night. The last time Naya heard anything about her, she was serving time in the state penitentiary for being caught drunk behind the wheel for the 3rd time. Naya kept drawing a complete blank. She knew that she couldn't be dreaming. She felt the warm air of a heater on a nearby table blowing in her face. This had to be real. She couldn't remember when she'd showed up to the cafe. There were other people sitting next to her table. Some were sitting by themselves, looking out the window facing out onto 12th Avenue, deep in thought. Others are laughing with old acquaintances. It made Naya wish that her niece was sitting at the table with her. After she pictured Avery's brown curly hair and blue eyes in her mind, she saw her walk through the door of the cafe like a vision come to life. All Naya could feel was a combination of relief and excitement. Avery began to talk to her, but she didn't hear the words. An overwhelming feeling of happiness overtook her body. Naya finally worked up the courage to give her niece one of her famous Auntie Naya hugs, ignoring what she just told her. She smiled and took Naya's hand. "Don't worry, Aunt Naya. I'll never leave you again," she heard Avery say as Naya took her hand and led her out of the cafe to the entrance of the nearby subway station. After receiving a pair of tickets, the two hopped onto one of the subway trains together, holding each other's hands. The subway seemed to travel down the set of old steel tracks for ages as it sped out of the city and cut through the rolling hills of a green valley. Small towns popped up every once in a while between each stretch of landscape. Naya and Avery passed on the way to their final destination. On their way home to start a new life, Naya asked Avery where she'd been all these years. "With Dad," Avery had replied. "Dad took me back and made me live with him. I was so afraid to leave, but Daddy said I'd be all right. He took me to the place we're going. He told me you'd probably be at the cafe if I met you at the right time. I wanted to be the first person to find you no matter what." Naya all at once felt very weak in the knees. Avery's father had died a few months before she was born. Her niece had to be mistaken. Perhaps some man like her father had been taking care of her, but no, that didn't seem right. Naya stared down at her niece, who was smiling up at her. A headache started to form at the back of her head, but everything was starting to become clearer now. It was the fact she'd assumed that she'd stopped at the cafe on her way home from work that got her to thinking. Naya never remembered reaching the cafe in her car. It was as if she'd just shown up there and started waiting for her niece to arrive. It made little sense that they were taking the subway, since Naya had supposedly showed up at the cafe in her car, and the two had no reason to be heading out of the city. Naya lived in an apartment not far from where the cafe was situated. She just had to jump in her car and take the freeway to the downtown area and... the freeway. Another wave of pain shot through her head as she started to recall all the moments leading up to sitting in the cafe. She remembered that she was driving on the freeway, headed to meet with a cafe regular about a possible sighting of her niece. That's when a truck had started to tailgate her from behind. Frustrated, she tried to go faster, but the truck caught up with her again. This speeding game continued for a while until the truck became impatient and attempted to pass her on the side. But he didn't give her enough room, and he ended up sliding into the side of her car. The last thing she remembered was a tall, lanky man banging on her car window. He was yelling through the window, asking her over and over if she was okay. She looked around her and saw that her car was turned upside down. For some reason, she couldn't move any of her limbs. She could only hear the man saying that he'd called for an ambulance and to hold on as everything had faded into darkness. And then she'd ended up in the cafe, waiting for her niece like nothing had happened. Naya felt her emotions wash over her like a wave. She put her arms around Avery and held her for what seemed like an eternity. Naya held her niece for so long that Avery had fallen asleep in her arms. Naya laid her niece gently on her lap to allow her to continue resting. She took her cell phone out of her purse after a while and scrolled through the list of names in her contact list to her sister's cell phone number. She knew she couldn't reach Helen by the number in her cell phone. Helen was locked up behind bars on account of her latest drinking incident, and there was no way she could personally visit the state prison to get any message about her daughter's whereabouts to her, now that she'd passed on. Holding the cell phone in her hand, Naya left a single text message on her sister's cell phone, knowing she would probably never receive it. It read, "I found Avery. You don't have to worry anymore. I'm going to make sure she's happy from now on." Damn, if Helen's ever sober enough to get her cell phone privileges back, there's a chance she might finally know that I've reunited with her daughter. And maybe then she'll be comforted knowing that I intend to care for Avery until it's her turn to return home. Naya thought to herself as she slipped the cell phone into her purse and watched Avery sleep on her lap as the subway train pressed on far outside the boundaries of New York City limits. After traveling for a few hours, the two of them finally reached their old home in the suburbs, where they'd once lived before Naya had moved to the city. She'd rented a small apartment to have easier access to the cafe people had reported to see her niece hanging around in. It was also within walking distance of her job. She thought about who would take care of her apartment now that she was gone. She wondered what would happen to all of her possessions. It was a strange feeling pondering everything that would happen after she was dead. The subway reached the suburban area where Naya's house had once been located. She assumed that it was her place to get off. She gently awoke Avery and the two stepped off the subway onto the platform. They walked up the street above and made their way to the house the two of them had once lived in. As Naya stood at the iron large gates of the Victorian-style house her niece and she had once lived in 8 long years ago, she felt a tear slide down her cheek. It had taken many years, but Naya was finally reunited with the young girl she'd always viewed as her own daughter. Her niece continued to hold her hand as the two of them walked through the large iron gates of the property to the house's front yard. Nia smiled when she realized that, from this day forward, the two of them could live the rest of their lives out together in the place made of the landscape of their dreams. It was a year before Helen was released from the state prison, but she'd heard about her sister's death while she was still serving her time. The news had devastated her. She'd once been angry at her sister for losing sight of Avery, but now she couldn't bring herself to be angry at her anymore. For the first time in her life, she was able to accept some of the blame. If she'd just been a better mother to Avery, then she would never have been taken away to live with Nia. She could have prevented the disappearance of her daughter and the death of her sister. They told her that Nia had been driving to follow up on a sighting someone had had of her niece at a downtown cafe. That was when the truck hit her car, and she wasn't able to hold on to life before the medical team of paramedics arrived. Helen had gone through an AA program when she was at the state prison and was now sober. Today was the first real time she'd had to visit her sister's grave. She was still locked up when the family had held the funeral. Although she couldn't make it, her mother had visited and brought photos and news of the event. Her mother had also told her to think about how her action had led to everything that had happened, and begged her to start turning herself around before she was met with more tragedies in her life. Helen took her mother's words to heart, and had been working hard to stay sober and employed. Shortly after being released, she started working in a small flower shop near the cafe her sister used to frequent. She liked working there because flowers reminded her of her sister. Nia had had her own garden when she was still alive. She rented the same apartment her sister lived in, as it had fallen unoccupied after her death. She visited the cafe every day in hopes that she'd find some news about her daughter. It was an early Saturday afternoon when she took a taxi out to one of the inner-city grave sites to visit her sister's final place of rest. She was carrying a bouquet of flowers from the shop she worked in. She'd made it specially for this occasion, with all of her sister's favorite candies and even a stuffed bear she knew her sister would like if she was still alive. When she reached the cemetery, she walked along the path until she saw the row her sister's memorial was located in. She walked along the path of headstones until she saw her sister's name carved on a stone that read, "In memory of Nia Stevens, a loving daughter, sister, aunt, and friend." She placed the bouquet of flowers at the base of the grave and had a moment of silence in honor of Nia. As she stood praying over her sister's gravestone, she heard her cell phone's ringtone blare from her back jean pockets. "In your house, I long to be, room by room, patiently. I'll wait for you there, like a stone. I'll wait for you there, alone." The familiar sound of the ringtone she'd set for her text message notifications cut through the silence. She considered taking her cell phone out and silencing it, but something told her not to. The ringtone continued to play into the empty spaces around her. "And on I read until the day was gone, and I sat in regret of all the things I've done, for all that I've blessed and all that I have wronged. In dreams until my death I will wander on." The ringtone finished its final pass. Then a sharp buzz sounded, letting her know that a text message had just been sent and was waiting for her to view it. Helen couldn't explain why she felt so compelled to look at her cell phone. Even though she ignored most text messages when she was doing something important, she felt as though she should read whatever text message was sent her way. She pulled the cell phone out of her pocket and read the text message that had set off her cell phone's ringtone. The message read, "I found Avery. You don't have to worry anymore. I'm going to make sure she's happy from now on." Helen put her hand to her mouth in shock. It was a message from her sister. It was dated the exact day and hour that she died in the accident with the truck. At that moment, something clicked inside of her. A deep-rooted instinct of knowing that all of her deepest fears had come to pass. She somehow understood the meaning of her sister's last words. She wasn't going to see Avery again. Not in this plane of living. Not until she crossed over into wherever death had taken two of the most cherished people in her life. The realization that Naya and her daughter were together gave her a mixed sense of peace and sadness. She was at peace because she knew her sister would take care of her daughter in the afterlife, but she was also sad that she would never get to see her daughter alive in this realm of existence again. Helen sunk to the base of her sister's grave, grasping the cell phone in her hands. She held the cell phone close to her face, with her sister's last message displayed on the screen, and wept at the base of her grave for what seemed like forever. The late-night creature feature in Pompeii, Indiana. There's an almost universal feeling of discomfort and unease that a person experiences when they see a deserted place that their mind tells them should be full of people. A stark feeling of wrongness and creeping dread that is perhaps a holdover from our animalistic ancestors, meant to warn us when danger is fast approaching. I think most people are familiar with the sensation, but few know that it has a name. Kenopsia. Now, kenopsia is defined by the Dictionary of Obscure Sorrows as the eerie, forlorn atmosphere of a place that's usually bustling with people, but is now abandoned and quiet. Like a school hallway in the evening, long after classes have let out, an unlit office building over the weekend, a store display window after dark, or vacant fairgrounds totally devoid of anyone to enjoy them. Basically, it's a kind of emotional after-image that creates a feeling of not just emptiness, but hyper-emptiness, the kind that seeps into the soul. In a way, it could be described as a kind of haunting, but rather than being haunted by some lingering supernatural malignancy, one who experiences kenopsia is haunted by what is not there but should be. I've experienced kenopsia on several occasions throughout my comparatively short life, but the one that stands out in my memory is the night my older brother Caleb and I found ourselves in a place called Pompeii, Indiana, after a long night of driving aimlessly down some back roads high on psychedelics. Now I'm certain that many rational people will use my admission that I was using drugs that night as an excuse to dismiss the entire experience as a simple hallucination brought on by intoxication. And that'd be fair. I may have been inclined to do the same were I in their shoes. But one cannot hallucinate the deep scars that now mark my body to this day, and I've yet to find a drug that could cause a person to simply cease to exist in the way I witnessed that night, but, well, I digress. You will not find Pompeii, Indiana on any map, and Google searches of the town's name will best give you the address of a pizza place in Lake County, as well as a large serving of disappointment and palpable frustration. Believe me, I've tried. My attempts to retrace the journey my brother and I took, and to pin down an exact geographic location of the town I very nearly lost my life in, have so far proven to be futile. The most I can tell you is that it should be located somewhere about 2.5 hours south of Indianapolis, as far as I could tell. Well, when you're tripping on acid, it's hard to keep track of landmarks and road signs, amidst the backdrop of ever-shifting, kaleidoscopic hallucinations and euphoric sensations that demand your attention for hours at a time. Honestly, in hindsight, it's a miracle that we didn't crash the car. I'd say we were lucky, but knowing where we ended up, that would be a lie. It all started at our parents' house in Brownsburg, Indiana, around midnight. Our folks had just left for an out-of-state vacation that Caleb and I had declined to accompany them on, with the somewhat plausible excuse that neither of us could take the time off of work that would have been required to accompany them. But, in reality, he and I had been strategically planning to embrace the golden opportunity that was their absence, to have a drug-fueled night of excitement ever since we'd learned that they were going on vacation some months prior. Our parents had barely made it out of the driveway and down the dimly lit street before Caleb dashed up to his room on the second floor of our 3-story house and quickly returned with what looked to be a wad of aluminum foil and a mischievous twinkle in his eyes. "Oh man, bro, this is gonna be so fucking sweet," he'd said. He then wasted no time placing the wad on the kitchen counter and unwrapping it with care, revealing what looked like neatly cut little paper squares that were small enough to fit on the tip of a finger. I, being the younger of the two of us, and at the time woefully inexperienced in the world of controlled substances, felt a mixture of exhilaration and nervousness as Caleb instructed me to take one of the paper squares from the foil and place it under my tongue, only to be very underwhelmed by the lack of any detectable changes in my perceptions after the first couple of minutes. "I don't feel anything, Caleb. Are you sure your guy didn't sell you bullshit?" I asked him, with concern and impatience seeping into my voice. Caleb chuckled, as if I'd said something extremely childish, before reassuring me. "Give it time. The chemicals take a while to reach the brain." "Well, how will I know when it's working?" "Trust me. You'll know." I took him at his word, and we spent the next 45 minutes or so just hanging out in our spacious living room, flipping absent-mindedly through channels on the TV, waiting for the acid to work its magic, when I made the suggestion that I'd regret for the rest of my natural life. "I'm hungry, man. Why don't we go down the street real quick and grab something to eat before we're both too high to function?" Caleb, being the only one out of the two of us with a license and a car, scratched his head as if weighing the pros and cons of the idea, before he conceded with a shrug. "Sure, as long as it's just down the street and back, we should be okay." My vision was starting to vibrate at this point, and any notion of how dangerous getting into a car in the state we were in was chased away by the marvelous visions that had begun dancing before my eyes. After a few minutes of fumbling around through the fastly developing wonderland that was forming around us for our coats, shoes, and Caleb's keys, both of us somewhat clumsily loaded ourselves into Caleb's Silverado, pulled out of the driveway, and proceeded down the street toward a string of local fast food places at a languid pace. Well, it's worth mentioning at this part of my story that Caleb had a terrible sense of direction, one that I and practically everybody that knew him teased him for relentlessly. He'd often get lost driving to the houses of friends that lived just a few blocks over. Well, this, coupled with the fact that both of us were now tripping balls on acid, it should come as no surprise that Caleb somehow managed to completely pass the fast food joints and steer us onto the highway. We were both so far gone that we must have driven for a good 20 minutes before either of us realized that we were lost. Once we did, we were basically the blind leading the blind, both of us arguing back and forth about which turn to make and which exit to use, when neither of us really had any idea of where the hell we were going. It wasn't all bad, to tell you the truth. I mean, in some ways, it was a lot of fun. Our short trip to get fast food had become an all-out psychedelic adventure through the open fields and winding country roads of our little slice of the Midwest. We laughed, joked, argued, and debated with one another about all manner of things while we looked in awe at the sights and sensations the drug we'd both taken was producing for us. Eventually, though, as it became clear to both of us that we were thoroughly lost with the way back to the house nowhere in sight, we agreed that it would be best to stop somewhere and get our bearings, maybe even get a hotel for the night, until we were clear-minded enough to find our way back home, even though the prospect of trying to have normal social interactions with anyone, given how high we both were, seemed like a Herculean task. And that was when I first noticed the ashes that fell from the otherwise clear summer sky, like snow. I dismissed it as just another hallucination at first. Gradually, though, as it started to collect on the windshield and obstruct our vision to the point where Caleb had to turn on his windshield wipers so he could drive safely, I realized that it was real. I turned to Caleb for verification of this, on the off chance that I was just hallucinating. "Hey, man, do you see that?" "Yeah, man, it's really weird." "Yeah, totally weird." After After driving for another few miles down the road through the strangest weather phenomenon either of us had ever experienced, we saw a large, weathered old sign in the distance that was all faded paint and rotting wood that read, "Welcome to Pompeii, Indiana," in big, bold letters, overlooking what seemed to be a decent-sized town, complete with a motel, a gas station, a town hall, a diner, a school, a few rows of old-looking houses here and there, and what from the distance looked like an old-school drive-in movie theatre, all covered in a slowly growing blanket of ashes. Well, it wasn't exactly inviting, but any port will do in a storm, as the saying goes, so we decided to check it out. If a town could ever be accurately compared to a recently hollowed-out corpse, then Pompeii would definitely be the perfect candidate for that comparison. Everywhere we looked, we were confronted by a complete and utter lack of any noticeable signs of human life, or any life at all for that matter, despite the fact that in contrast to the weathered old sign that had welcomed us in, nothing we saw looked particularly old or dilapidated at all. In fact, some of the machines and appliances left scattered around the apparently abandoned buildings showed clear signs of recent use. We stopped at the gas station first to fill up and grab some snacks, since neither of us had eaten anything since our ill-fated journey had begun. And what we saw once we passed through the open glass double doors and made our way inside was equal parts confusing and unsettling. Directly in front of us was a row of about 6 or so commercial coffee pots that had all still had steam rising out of their tops, as if freshly brewed. Off to the left was the checkout counter where the register drawer stood open and a pack of cigarettes lay on its side next to it, as if whoever had been working the counter had just set them down in the middle of ringing them up and just left without even bothering to close the drawer. The air pump out in the parking lot was running, although there were no cars anywhere in sight, and since those machines generally tend to run for only about a few minutes at most after someone puts enough quarters in it, logically speaking, someone had to have turned it on in the last few minutes. But there were no visible signs of anyone that I could see, nor were there any obvious clues to where the people who had to have lived there had gone. No tracks in the ash that blanketed the ground, no hastily handwritten note saying, "Out to lunch," or offering any kind of explanation to where the fuck everyone was. It was just deafening silence, and a profound feeling of isolation. It wasn't just the gas station either. Everywhere we looked, the outcome was the same. The diner was all but abandoned, its retro interior clearly meant to replicate the atmosphere of a 1950s burger joint. It was totally barren. No people anywhere to be seen, though almost every single table was loaded with at least 5 or 6 plates of food apiece, all of which were still warm to the touch, as if the place had been packed with families getting ready to enjoy a hearty evening meal with one another just a few moments earlier, before they just left and went somewhere, somehow. Just like at the gas station, we could see no cars in sight. We stopped for a moment to help ourselves to a few plates of the abandoned meals, before checking out a few of the other buildings, namely the derelict motel and a few of the houses, only to find more of the same. At this point in our journey, the hallucinogenic effects of the acid we'd taken was beginning to work against Caleb and I. Our feelings of carefree foolishness and euphoria had morphed into unease and steadily growing paranoia, and the acid was only amplifying that. Everywhere I looked, I saw shadows moving in the periphery of my vision, but whenever I turned to confront them, they'd be gone. I could feel sweat starting to gather on my forehead and a cold, tingling feeling start to crawl up the small of my back. And Caleb wasn't doing much better. I could see him visibly shaking and watch his eyes dart from side to side in rapid, panicky movements as he paced back and forth in the empty motel parking lot where both of us now stood next to the parked Silverado, trying to figure out what to do next. His face had begun to contort and wilt, almost like it was melting off of his head the longer I stood and stared at him. I had to verbally remind myself that his face only looked that way because I was on drugs, but, well, the more I repeated it to myself, the more it sounded like a lie. "Calm down. You're tripping. Everything's fine. Everything's fine," I repeated to myself like a prayer. Where the fuck is everyone? Caleb had yelled in transparent frustration, now looking only vaguely recognizable as himself to my eyes. His normally unkempt sandy blonde hair now looked blue and tattered, and his head had swelled to at least twice its regular size. His mouth was lopsided, and only a single glassy eye could be seen on his now horribly distorted face. I must have been gawking at him with wide-eyed terror, because he stopped pacing for a minute to see what was up with me. "Hey, you okay? Do I have something on my face?" I bit back the urge to tell him he looked like a freaking alien out of one of those low-budget 80s horror movies, and did my best to respond with coherent sentences. No, you're fine. I'm just really fucking high, and I don't want to be here." "Well, neither do I." "Fuck this, man. Let's just get the hell out of here. Literally anywhere would be better than here." "Agreed." And with that, we hopped back into the Silverado and gunned down the road, back towards the highway, maintaining a very tense silence between the two of us as we went. Neither of us could really put into words at that time, but we felt in our bones that something was very off about that place. The ashes that fell from the sky had ceased gently falling like snow, and now whirled around the truck like winds of a blizzard, devouring the highway in front of us. And even after Caleb had turned his brights on, we could only see maybe a few feet of road in front of us. We didn't care. We just wanted to get out of that place as fast as we could. We didn't make turns, and we sure as shit didn't turn around. I'm sure of it. Yet after about 15 minutes or so of gunning it down the highway as fast as we could, we were once again face to face with that decrepit, rotting old sign that read, "Welcome back to Pompeii, Indiana." Without skipping a beat, Caleb whipped the truck around and took off in the opposite direction, only to have the same thing happen again, and another time after that. After we found ourselves in front of that goddamn sign for the 5th time, I remember pounding my fist against the dash out of sheer frustration before I turned and started screaming at my brother. "What the fuck is wrong with you? You have one job, Caleb, and that's to get us the fuck out of here. Why is that so frickin' hard?" Caleb didn't respond to me right away. He just sat there staring at the eroded, ancient-looking sign with an expression of pure bewilderment. His face looked relatively normal to me now, which made no sense given that he told me that the acid we took usually lasted about 9 hours on average, and there was simply no way that 9 hours had passed already. I don't know." This was all he could manage to say. That was when I noticed the drive-in movie theater in the distance, or more specifically that there seemed to be a movie playing on the towering projection screen. It was almost impossible to make out what was playing from that distance, but regardless, the sight filled me with a desperate kind of hope because, after all, if a movie was playing, that meant someone had to be down there working the projector, and maybe that someone could tell us what the hell was going on. "Hey, there's a movie playing down there," I said, pointing to the drive-in. Caleb followed my finger with his gaze down to the drive-in and at the movie playing on the screen, before looking back at me with a confused look. "So?" "What do you mean, so? If there's a movie playing, then there have to be people down there." "Oh, we can't be sure of that." "Well, do you have any better ideas about what we should do?" "I'll tell you what we should do. We should stay the fuck away from that town. This is beyond creepy." "Do what? Sit here forever? There could be someone down there who could help us." Caleb conceded with a frown. "Oh, God, I don't like this, bro. I don't like this at all." He then put the truck back into drive and reluctantly took us back through the deserted streets of Pompeii towards the theater. And since I can say with confidence that I was totally clear-minded at this point, I noticed small details here and there that I'd totally overlooked before. When we passed the empty church building, for instance, I saw a rather ominous message scrawled on the sidewalk just outside the main entrance that read, "Here we were deceived." The more I looked around, the more I found that similar messages had been scrawled along the entranceways and sidewalks of, several places all around town. One such message, inscribed along the sidewalk that bordered the diner, read, "Here we went unnourished." Yet another that I saw written outside of the town hall read, "Here we were betrayed." But the message that was easily the most unsettling out of all the ones I saw was the one scrawled over the faded sign over the entrance to the drive-in itself that read, "Here we bore witness." The gate itself hung open and offered an unobstructed path into the theatre, which seemed to consist of a large open parking area that, unlike virtually anywhere else in town, was packed with cars from end to end, and what looked like some sort of concession stand located roughly at its center. We could see the dim silver light of the projector as it filled the enormous screen at the northernmost end of the drive-in, with what looked like an old-fashioned black-and-white movie that hadn't seemed to have progressed past its opening credits. Names of actors and companies I'd never heard of scrolled slowly down the length of the screen before the movie opened to a scene of an idyllic-looking Midwestern town, overlooked by a starry night sky that, in some ways resembled the one we now found ourselves in. Before I could turn to Caleb and discuss what we should have done next, the screeching static of the Silverado's radio pierced the silence that prevailed between the two of us, before it morphed into what we assumed was the radio that accompanied the movie. At first it was this really corny-sounding jingle, the likes of which you'd expect to see on an old commercial. Then it abruptly became a loud crashing sound as one of the stars that graced that beautiful night sky on the screen fell to earth below and made a large crater in the woods just outside of the town. The scene then shifted to a young boy who looked to be around high school age, walking through those same woods alone in the daytime. He wandered around aimlessly until he happened upon the crater, which had by then been filled up to the edges with a strange viscous black liquid. The boy then sat along the edge of the pool, regarding it curiously, as if debating with himself about whether or not he wanted to touch it, when a stream of bubbles rose up to the pool center and started to pop one after the other, and each pop bubble carried with it a word from a voice that sounded remarkably human, almost like that of a young girl. "Hello? Who are you?" the voice asked. Each syllable sounded strained and unnatural, as if whatever was making them had not quite mastered human speech. The boy, for his part, seemed shocked at first, but his shock quickly changed into rapt fascination, and he started talking back. "Hello, I'm Ronnie," he said. "Ronnie," the voice echoed. "Who are you?" "I am lost." "Lost?" the boy named Ronnie repeated, sounding confused. "Lost. I am lost. I want to go home. Can I help?" "Small. I'm too small. I must grow." "You must grow," Ronnie repeated, his face suddenly becoming vacant and expressionless. He then turned and walked in the opposite direction, back towards town, repeating, "She must grow. She must grow," to himself, like a mantra. The scene then changed again, this time showing Ronnie and another boy who was approximately the same age, walking through the same woods toward the pool. "It's just this way," Ronnie said, his voice distant and unnatural, which didn't seem to be lost on the other boy. "Sure, Ronnie. Whatever you say. Are you feeling okay? You sound weird." "I'm fine. We're almost there." The boy didn't seem reassured, but went along regardless. When the pair finally came upon the pool once again, Ronnie gestured to it with veneration. The other boy seemed to think it was mesmerizing. He knelt by the edge and watched the bubbling black liquid with wide-eyed fascination, while Ronnie slowly and subtly maneuvered behind it. "This is so cool, Ronnie. What is it?" The boy was barely able to utter the word "it" before Ronnie pushed him in with all the force he could muster, and upon making physical contact with the liquid, the other boy let out a heartbreaking scream. Oily black tendrils reached up from the depths of the pool and constricted around him like pythons. You could hear the sickening sound of his bones snapping as the tendrils began pulling him down slowly but surely. He thrashed around and cried out desperately for his friend to help him, but Ronnie remained still and just watched the horror unfolding in front of him with that same vacant, dispassionate look in his eyes. "She must grow," he said. Eventually the other boy vanished beneath the liquid completely, and the pool began to expand ever so slightly, the black ooze flowing past its edges. No more words were spoken aloud between Ronnie and the entity inside the pool, but he seemed to be aware of its will nonetheless. The next few scenes played out in a similar fashion, Ronnie luring hapless victims to their inevitable fate in the woods, and the pool steadily expanding with each new sacrifice. Before long, the pool had become a large pond, and not long after that a small lake. As it grew, it devoured the plant life it came into contact with voraciously. Trees and other vegetation that were unfortunate enough to be in its path withered and died almost before my eyes as I watched that horrible black ooze creep ever closer to the town itself. Though it was never explicitly stated by any of the characters, I got the distinct impression, after the pool had expanded past a certain point, the entity no longer needed to rely on Ronnie for sustenance. Before long, others began to do its bidding as well. In one scene, a pastor of the local church led his day's congregation into the dying woods and the edge of the black ooze for baptism, and then watched them all die in the depths of that murky blackness one after another, before walking into the pool himself, with the most contented smile across his face as he did. In yet another scene, I couldn't bring myself to watch all the way through, a school bus driver veers off the road with a look of total vacancy in his eyes, and puts his foot to the gas as he drives towards the woods with reckless abandon and a busload of terrified kids. The film reached its climax when open conflict broke out between a group of townspeople who seemed to have retained their minds and those that had fallen under the sway of the voice from the pool. The conflict had been short and bloody, and although the townspeople had fought like cornered animals, they were ultimately subdued and corralled like livestock by their possessed neighbors. I scarcely have the words to describe the cold and detached depravity I witnessed on that screen. I've never considered myself the squeamish type, and I'd seen a lot of documentaries about things like the Holocaust and the Rwandan genocide in school growing up, so I wasn't totally unfamiliar with the concept of one group of humans setting out to systematically exterminate another. But what I saw on that screen was not like those events at all. There was no anger and no malice in it, no zealous demagogues spewing hateful rhetoric. The day's servants of the alien entity carried out their atrocity in near total silence. They didn't even speak to each other. One by one, they either bound people they'd likely known their whole lives with duct tape and ropes, scavenged from around town, and dragged them out into the woods completely oblivious to their pain cries and desperate pleas for mercy, or they simply beat them until they could no longer resist. In one instance, I saw a large man break the legs of a woman who could easily have been in her 80s before he hoisted her over his shoulder and carried her off into the blackness. In another, I saw a woman strangling a small girl that was her spitting image into unconsciousness and then carrying her limp form to the woods. Once everyone had been gathered up and brought to the edge of that liquid abyss that had swelled to far beyond its original size, what I can only describe as a kind of grotesque ritual took place. The elderly and infirm were pushed in first. Then came the men, and afterward the women, until only the children remained. I thought that the children would meet the same awful fate, only to be temporarily relieved when that didn't happen. Instead, I witnessed each and every one of the possessed people walk into the ooze and perish with joyous smiles painted on their dazed faces, leaving the children of the town bound and alone for several moments, before the boy called Ronnie emerged from the depths of the ooze and walked out onto the land, looking simultaneously younger and also ageless. The dark liquid of the pool fell from his eyelids and ran down his cheeks like teardrops, and a chillingly warm smile stretched across his freckled face. He spoke to the terrified little ones in a voice that was his own, and at the same time not. "Hello. Are you lost? Do you want to go home?" he asked. Common sense dictated that he was speaking to the children on the screen, but the angle of the camera made it seem as though he was speaking to me directly, and that made my blood run cold. The children's response to his question came in the form of gargled cries and terrified whines. "Don't be afraid, little ones. We'll all go home soon. Look how she has grown," he said as he turned to the ooze-filled crater with his arms outstretched as that thing slowly rose out of the pit. I've tried so hard to purge the image from my mind over the years with drugs, booze, and even blunt force trauma, but none of it could expel the image of those great black wings that eclipsed the moon and the stars. No amount of physical trauma could exorcise the sight of its 10 heads and 7 horns, each bellowing black ash and fire into the sky. Through Ronnie, I heard it speak each and every one of its blasphemous names, each more terrible than the last. I heard it speak of its home in the black void beyond the stars where all light goes to die, of the utter apathy of God and the complete meaninglessness of my own existence. At that point, I lost conscious awareness that I was watching just a movie, and I heard myself scream. Panic set in and I clawed frantically at the truck's door, only to find that Caleb had locked it. In the same instant that I realized this, I felt his hand on my shoulder, and I whipped around to see a serene, peaceful look on his face as black tears fell down his cheeks. "It's all right, brother. We're lost no more. It's time to go home," he said in that voice that was not his own, as he wrapped his hands around my neck. I struggled against his grip, but couldn't break free. Through the haziness of my oxygen-deprived brain, I could see Caleb's skin begin to bubble and blister, as if it had been exposed to unimaginably high temperatures, before I saw my brother erupt into blue flames, all while keeping that same serene expression on his face as he began to burn away. Out of sheer strength brought on by mortal terror, I threw him off of me, busted the passenger window with my elbow, and scrambled out and away from the Silverado just as the entire thing burst into flames. I then looked on in horror as my brother burned away into nothingness, so that not even a body remained, just the burned-out husk of a vehicle and an empty feeling of despair. The unnatural storm of ashes that had dogged us throughout this ill-fated journey had whipped up to unbelievable speeds at this point, pelting my skin and stinging my eyes, though I hardly noticed it. In truth, I felt I was going to die, and I was okay with it. I didn't want to be in that awful place alone. I laid on the cold asphalt and gravel, waiting for death's embrace, only to find myself in an unfamiliar hospital bed when I next opened my eyes. Over the next several days, I'd learned that I'd been found unconscious on the side of the highway by a passing trucker who'd in turn called the police and got me to a hospital. After I was awake and coherent enough to tell the doctors who I was and my family's contact information, my parents soon rushed over and nearly pulled me out of the bed when they embraced me. I was as grateful to see them as they were to see me, but they brought with them questions I really didn't know how to answer. Where did you go? What happened to you? And then, of course, the most painful question of them all. Where's Caleb? I had no words to form an answer, and I doubt they would have believed me if I did anyway. But my silence told them enough. I can still hear my mother's pained sobs that penetrated the thin walls of my room from outside in the hallway, and my father's softly spoken reassurances that did no real good. Eventually, the police came by to ask very similar questions, and they wouldn't take silence for an answer. The detective who I spoke with was a reserved and professional man who was very careful with his words. But I could tell that he didn't believe me when I told him that I had no recollection of what had happened to me and Caleb that night. "It'd be better for you in the long run if you told the whole truth, son," he told me. I knew that the whole truth would likely just land me in a mental ward, maybe even jail, and so I said nothing. Without any concrete evidence of foul play, the police eventually eased off of me. That didn't stop the rumors and the gossip around town, or the cold stares I got from people I passed on the street. In the absence of a true telling of events, it's human nature to construct your own. And the version of events that ended up circulating around town was that I'd murdered Caleb over drugs, or that maybe he'd overdosed on something and I'd left him to die. None of that was true, but people believed it and treated me accordingly. I was effectively a total pariah by the end of the month. That wasn't the worst of it, though. Those things all paled in comparison to the feeling I felt whenever I had walked by Caleb's empty room, which, in the months and years following his death, had become a kind of shrine to his memory. Whenever I look at his room now, I know what it is to be haunted. Real hauntings don't come from wraiths or spirits, but from memories and the knowledge that someone who should be there is not. That detective still comes around every now and again to check on me, and to ask if I'm ready to talk, though I always tell him that I have nothing to say. In a strange way, he's become like my only friend. I think I may tell him everything one day, when I have nothing else to lose and I can hold on to this thing no longer. There is no happy ending to my story, only a plea that you cherish those you love because you never know when they'll be gone from the world forever, and a warning that, if you ever find yourself in Pompeii, Indiana, for the love of God, stay away from the theater. Stay away from the late-night creature feature. The last drive-in theater I ever visited. This is the story of a monster. My name's Harold Brown. I'm 6'1", built like a Viking. Short and thick tree trunk legs, huge torso, big paunch. Thick blonde hair, blue eyes, hair everywhere, and gigantic arms capped by ham-sized fists. Suffice to say, when I go to Renaissance fairs, it's always as William Wallace. I go to a university in California, one of the last good ones, a hidden gem, really. And 5 months ago, I met my girlfriend, Cassandra. How we met is the stuff of, at once, dreams and nightmares. I was behind her in a drive-thru late at night and saw some guy climb into her car. I followed after her, frantically honking and flashing my brights to get her attention, but she evaded me, not knowing of the monster hiding behind her. Because I grew up on the farms and ranches surrounding this town, I quickly located the back roads they'd gone down and called in the police. Cassandra was still alive, and I met with her again after she was released from the hospital. Yeah, I knew I had to ask her out after the cops tried to take the bag of fast food that was in her car for evidence, and she ferociously snatched it back and mauled the burger in half a minute, in spite of being starkers and red as a tomato from head to toe, thanks to the bleach she'd been dunked in by that psycho. Coffee, movies, the great hole-in-the-wall restaurants I know around town, none of which were drive-through, since she'd officially sworn off of them. And whatever else a pair of students on a shoestring budget could manage. Her cascade of wine-red hair, which reminded me of my field of study, her mother-of-pearl skin and her vibrant blue eyes all marked a young woman who knew her way around an animal cell. I'd regale her with talk of wine and winemaking, geekery, the time I was shot while working as a security guard at the Santa Barbara County Fair and Expo, and books I grew up with. Star Wars' Expanded Universe, Raptor Red and Snow Crash, if you must know. and she would bless my ears with descriptions of cellular mitosis, Star Trek, which got her into science because Mr. Spock's her hero, and Mystery Science Theater 3000. I was already a fan, but she helped me truly appreciate the skits in between the movie segments. She called me her big Viking wolf. I call her my little Spitfire fox. To be honest, I probably wouldn't have met or talked to her or any other girl there at that university. It's not that I'm shy. Of the Myers-Briggs personality types, I'm an INFJ. Introverted, intuitive, feeling, judging. The rarest of them all. Great privacy, but great empathy. A healer, a crowd pleaser, but someone preferring their alone time and their own headspace. But more than just that, I struggle with feelings of intense self-hatred, none of which manifest on the surface because my nurturing nature doesn't want to spread that around. How do I find validation? Through helping others. Counseling helped and probably saved my life, but that self-hatred still pops up. All of it prompted by a traumatic 3 years when I was 9 at the hands of an ex-sister-in-law. But for now, these days, I'd managed to find a wonderful young woman who saw past my imperfections to the person under the carefully constructed mask. Dating bliss at last. We had to be careful, though. In our town, there's a significant homeless population, and some gangs, too. Most of the latter didn't bother with students, unless someone was behind on a drug tab. Most students' vices were beer and video games, and the former, they were usually pretty chill. There's even a mural of one, dubbed the Pirate, thanks to his eye patch and haggard demeanor. Every time a student would see him, they'd pump a fist and shout, "Arr, matey," and the pirate would shout, "Arr, matey," back. Nice guy. Loves Dos Equis beer, and if you buy him a drink or sandwich, he'll regale you with stories from his time working on a freight ship that are so outlandish and so ridiculous, they absolutely must be true. Unicorn Man. So named for the single dreadlock sticking up from his head at all times. He was a professor at the university until something he was researching just broke his mind. The Cop, named because of the tattered police shirt and cop hat he wore, was an abandoned Down syndrome baby, but the man could be trusted to walk women safely home on dark and frightening nights. Real class act, the Cop. Then there's some of the unsafe ones. The Martian, who thinks aliens are going to invade. Pigpen, who's only held together by all the parasites he carries holding hands. And Tapeworm, who was a dried-up, crap-spattered tail sticking out of his hands that's composed of the half-dead tapeworms dangling out of him, and keeps yelling about how his son was taken by polar bears. He was just a student that cracked from pressure and never went home. He'd become violent towards anyone with a small dog or cat, demanding they give him his son back and spend a night in jail. Once upon a time, we had institutions that helped these people, but because a relative few psychos turned them into their own personal Dr. Mxngled playgrounds, they mostly got closed down. Things everywhere would have been different if these folks got the help they needed. But I digress. One evening, when we'd finished our studies over a plate of taquitos and guacamole that had grown cold and limp and dark green, respectively, Cassandra looked up from her book and shut it with a heavy thud. "Let's go see a movie," she exclaimed, grinning that adorable way that she did. "Oh, as long as it's not the Star Wars prequel," I groaned. She scoffed, as if you even had to say it. After what Jar Jar Abrams did to Star Trek, I'm not wasting time on that hooey. See? Dream woman. Okay, so, how about Ant-Man? I asked. Oof, I haven't seen much in way of the Marvel movies. She shrugged. Got one you want to see then? I asked as I stood up, slipping my huge work boots on. The boost Cassandra joked could be used as lifeboats in the event of a catastrophic flood. I don't know. What do you want to see? She asked, twirling a strand of that red hair around her finger. Very helpful, Foxy. Well, Mad Max Fury Road sounds like fun, I supplied. She tilted her head in thought. I'd shown her all 3 movies after I discovered our mutual love of Fallout, and she liked Thunderdome the most. Well, I'm more of a Road Warrior fan myself. Okay, Fury Road it is, she chirped. It was wonderful to see her cheering and smiling like this. She was shaky and paranoid the first month after her ordeal, but time, dates, and distracting schoolwork and recreation has got a way of helping you forget the horrors that have been visited upon you. I checked the listings on my phone, and the only showing that would conclude at a civilized time was at a drive-in theatre. It had been in town for as long as anyone could remember, near a trailer park. Every Sunday, there'd be a swap meet there, and on occasion, we'd pay a visit to see what second-hand goodies we could find. I mentioned this, and Cassandra hesitated, biting her lip anxiously. Hey, it's all right. We can wait for another showing. We'll find another movie, I said with a smile, scratching my fingers up and down her back the way she liked. No, it's okay. Let's go. I shouldn't let some scary crap define me for the rest of my life. She shot to her feet, a fist melodramatically thrust in the air. God, what a dork. What a beautiful, wonderful dork. Taking my truck, we stopped at a gas station on the way to grab snacks. Since movie theater snack prices are usually somewhere between kidney and firstborn child. But, at Cassandra's insistence, we got fresh popcorn from the concession stand. I've got to support the local business after all. Fortunately, we like our popcorn the same way, drenched in that fluid they somehow get away with calling butter, and generously salted to the point that the mere sight of the torso-sized tub of pop kernels caused our arteries to shrivel up like twigs. Armed with our gas station candy, sodas and popcorn, we drove to a spot, tuned the radio to the drive-in frequency, and relaxed. Ahead of us, another couple in a little blue Prius were watching, frequently tearing themselves away to steal kisses while the cocker spaniel dog in the back stole mouthfuls of popcorn. Well, I relaxed. Cassandra kept reaching into her purse to feel the comforting grip of her taser, the same one that had ended the life of her would-be murderer. She eventually settled down, sampled some popcorn, nibbled on her Snickers bar, and sipped at her soda pop. The film was extremely exciting, and it drew Cassandra in. I kept looking over at her, making sure she felt comfortable and was enjoying herself. That was more important to me than the film. Around the time Max blew up the guy decked out in ammo, I want that hat now, by the way, the intermission came. 15 minutes to get out of the car, relax, get a snack or use the facilities. Cassandra needed the latter most, and before asking me to go with her, I offered to escort her myself. Making sure I locked my truck, smiling reassuringly at her, I took her along to the restrooms. One of these brick affairs set up near the same building they kept the projectors in and sold concessions from. I waited outside and surveyed the dark landscape of cars, watching snacks and drinks dance invitingly on the screen. Yeah, real subtle. I leaned against the bricks near the women's restroom entrance, gazing up at the stars. You can make out most of them, given the small size of the towns around here. I heard jingling and clicking approaching from the drive-thru and glanced down, seeing the dog, that popcorn-stealing cocker spaniel, trotting along, leash trailing behind it. Uh-oh, looks like we got a jailbreaker, I exclaimed with a laugh, bringing my giant boot down on the leash before leaning down to seize it. Let's get you back to your folks, silly boy. I walked the dog back towards our spot, and noticed the car ahead of my truck had its driver door wide open and was completely empty. I glanced towards the concession stand, spotting a few people, but None of them looked like the couple from the car. I started to walk towards it, when the dog became immediately agitated, barking, growling and making a real fuss. "Easy now, buddy. It's all right," I consoled the unhappy canine. "I'm sure they're okay." That sounded like a hollow lie even to myself. I slowly rounded the back of the couple's car and peered into the cabin. It was completely dark, so I fished out my phone and turned on the flashlight, shining it into the parked Prius. Dark, red, soaking the upholstery and the console. Oh my God. I saw a bloody hand sticking out from under the car, and the dog let out a mournful whimper. I scooped him up under one arm and scrambled like the devil himself when nipping at my heels, darting back to the concession stand. I banged a fist on the door to the women's restroom. "Occupied," Cassandra snarled from inside. "Give me a minute." "Cassie, baby, lock the door in there. Don't unlock it," I bellowed, then staggered to the concession stand, scaring the crap out of the poor, acne-riddled freshman with dark circles under his eyes, manning the place. "Holy shit, dude," he yelped, bloodshot eyes widening in surprise. "Listen, call the police. Someone's been hurt," I yelled. He stared at me for a few moments, jaw slack. What?" A skeptical mumble struggled its way from his mouth. "Murder. Call cops freaking now," I bellowed, banging my fist on the counter for emphasis, then ran all the way back to the truck, panting hard. I tossed the dog into the back and snatched Cassandra's taser from her purse. I spun around just in time to see a dirty, haggard face framed by stringy, greasy hair and a pair of venomously angry, dark brown eyes boring into mine. I got a half second to let out a startled shout before I felt a cold impact in my abdomen, accompanied by a rigid stiffness. It was tapeworm, and he just buried an old kitchen knife in my belly. I could tell it had penetrated abdominal muscles, but where the knife wound up, it was mostly adipose that was pierced. And the thick shall inherit the earth. I'm a gentle soul by nature, and can count on one hand the number of fights I've been in. One time when I was in 4-H, one more thing I have in common with Cassie, I held off a gang of kids from beating up my little brother. At Boy Scout camp, I got into a fight with a big lummox who picked on me excessively. And thirdly, I was shot in the torso by an idiot punk with his idiot girlfriend because they wanted to get into the fair after closing hours. I did the same thing when stabbed that I did when shot. I became enraged. I have a deep-seated rage issue stemming from a ruined childhood at the hands of the ex-sister-in-law, the one I mentioned earlier, who tortured me whenever no one was around. From between when I was 9 years old to when I was 12, when my brother divorced her for unrelated reasons, well, I never told anyone what happened, save for the counselors, and frankly, that's a lengthy story for another time. But I always found outlets for that rage, so it never controlled me. Games, a little time at the sharpshooting range, a little kickboxing. It vented perfectly. But when this poor, broken and delusional man stabbed me, it was something he immediately regretted. My vision reddened and I leaped forward, the same way I had after that chisel-jawed punk put a bullet in me. I brought my fists down on him, muscle toned from long hours on the farm and ranch I grew up on, burning as I struck him across the face as he screamed. "Son, get out the truck. Run away, boy. Get help," he cried to the cocker spaniel whose owners he'd butchered in a delusional stupor as I rained one blow after another down on him. You know that little bit of restraint you have? That restraint that keeps you from putting your full potential strength into a blow. That well-trained part of your superego that's told you it's not good to hit people. Well, in that moment, as in the 3 fights of my life before. That restraint fell away as I broke his jaw, cracked his cheekbone, felt his ribs crack under my unrelenting and brutal assault, as all the built-up rage, frustration, and grief inside me poured out into this man. Somewhere in all this fray, the knife had come out of me, and I was bleeding all over. By the time the police arrived, I was standing over him and was bringing a size 13 triple E work boot down on his femur, snapping it like a toothpick. All the while, the movie continued. Seems the kid in the booth was too shaken to think to turn it off. And while Immortan Joe was driving his souped-up hot rod on the big screen, the rest of the drive-in's patrons watched on, oblivious to the mayhem happening less than 100 feet away. The cops shone their light on me. I heard them bellow at me to stop, and when I looked up at them, the rage burned still. And according to the dashcam footage I later saw, thanks to a friend of the family in the police department, they had just cause to believe I was about to attack them. This distraction, though, was enough for my gentle side, what I hope is my real self, to grab the reins again. The adrenaline rush ebbed, and after taking one step, my strength left me, like the blood of mine pooled around my feet. I collapsed. I have faint memories of Cassandra walking alongside the gurney that the paramedics had managed to get my giant self onto, holding my hand. She called me her warrior, her protector, her knight in shining armor. Please, no, baby, don't call me those things. She rode with me to the hospital, and I woke up to her and my family gathered around. Cassie's dorm mates were even there. Nicole, the activist girl, Jeannie, the nice but bubble-headed beauty queen who had yet to pick a major, and the perpetually cheerful and extra thick goth, Gloria. My brothers joked about how I needed to get a slash on my torso, and my battle damage would be complete after I've been shot and stabbed now. Mum and Dad were their usual supportive selves. Cassandra kept calling me brave, heroic, and mighty. No, I'm none of those things. The detective who came to interview me, Jack Cunningham, explained that the couple that Tapeworm had attacked had not survived their injuries. Wow, you really tore up that guy, Cunningham said. I felt sick to my stomach, but not because of the dull pain where I'd been stabbed, which was throbbing with infection that a cocktail of painkillers and antibiotics was battling. I looked away from him, trying to hide my shame. Then he grinned. Can't say he didn't deserve it, Cunningham said. No, God no, don't say that. Am I going to jail? I mumbled. This completely falls under self-defense, but you beat the guy to within an inch of his life, and he's probably going to end up in the funny farm, the detective said. This is what it took. This is what it takes before people who need it get sent someplace where they can't hurt others or themselves. Oh. I'll come back with more questions and paperwork, but you go on and heal up, hero. This is pretty cut and dry, he said, giving me a thumbs up on his way out. Friends and family drifted in and out over the next week, and even the pirate sent a card saying, "Tape wasn't right in the head. Shame this happened. Get well soon, brother." It included a gift certificate for a big bottle of Honey Jacks. After I got out, I would frequently glance at the other homeless folk. No, not because I was afraid of being attacked, but looking for a scowl, a frown, a dirty look, something, anything to validate how loathsome I felt. Nothing of the sort. Why couldn't people see in me what I know exists? I finally went back to my dorm, hand in hand with Cassandra in one, and the leash of the newly adopted Cocker Spaniel in the other. And after sitting down, I hammered this whole story out. The monster I mentioned when I began? No, it wasn't Tapeworm. Beating a handicapped man with no control over his actions got labelled a heroic act. It sure as hell doesn't feel heroic. The monster I refer to lives inside me, the hide to my Jekyll. I know, on the surface, that I'd never hurt the ones I love, even when angry. But a primal fear always hides deep down. Our brains are divided into many different parts. Know why you get a headache looking at optical illusions? That's your brain arguing over what it's seeing. Whatever part of my brain that monster lives in, I pray to all that's good and holy that it's never unleashed again. That's why I've gone back to counseling. Cassandra says she's proud of me for it. She's the only one I've ever told any of this to. Well, until now. And I'll tell you all what she told me. You're worth healing. You're worth helping. You're worth being happy. I implore you, friends, battle those demons in your soul and don't do it alone. Once we graduate, I'm going to ask Cassandra to marry me. My tabletop game friends, Raoul and Mandy, gave me an engagement ring to give to her when the time's right. Well, I'm thinking Pismo Beach at the end of the pier, right when the moon is hovering over the ocean. Just not at a drive-in movie anytime soon. Thank you so much for taking the time to listen to this story today. Really means a lot to me and to the author of the story, of course. Well, if you want to know more about me, I'm pretty much everywhere on social media. You can find me on Facebook, Twitter, Instagram. You can download my music on SoundCloud. I've got a Patreon if you feel like. Throw me $1 or $2. Very much appreciated. And of course, on Reddit, I have a place where you can leave stories if you want me to read one that you've written. Well, hoping to see you all again very soon. Till then, sweet dreams. Bye-bye.